Argentina has once again warned Britain that it is ready to go to war over the Falklands and that the issue of sovereignty is not negotiable.
The British government today refused to elaborate in any way on whether or not a Royal Naval force was on its way to defend the Falkland Islands.
I do assure you that if Great Britain needs to call on the Royal Navy at any time, the Royal Navy will be there and ready.
British people!
They should be held!
Argentinian scum!
Have you heard from the governor at all this afternoon, sir?
Our cause is just. It is the cause of freedom and the rule of law. It is the cause of support for the weak against aggression by the strong.
What matters is we recover those islands. What matters is that the fleet is on its way. It has a lot of people on board.
One of the problems during our journey south is going to be keeping the men occupied and fully prepared for whatever they may be facing.
Ready! Fire!
One of our accompanying ships has reported the sighting of a submarine periscope.
The attack on the General Belgrano was said to be fully in accordance with the rules of engagement issued to British forces in the South Atlantic.
Good evening. The British destroyer HMS Sheffield has been hit by an Argentine missile and destroyed off the Falklands.
50 men died when Argentine planes bombed the landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram last Tuesday.
So the right to invade the island would be included under self-defence, in your view?
Most certainly, most certainly.
We're here for peace. We're here to save further lives being lost, and there are millions of people in Britain who agree with what we're saying.
You make it sound as if we invaded the Falklands to start with.
You did that on the 2nd of January 1833, sir.
And you did it on the 2nd of April 1982. We must leave it there, Mr. Herreras Vegas.
All the time, helicopters coming in, dropping in troops. See, come on.
Cheers.
Get out.
We're going to be committed to bad.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a short statement to make. Following the raids which we announced earlier today, British forces have now established a firm bridgehead on the Falkland Islands. Royal Marine Commandos and the Parachute Regiment are now ashore in substantial numbers with artillery, air defence weapons, and other heavy equipment already disembarked from our ships. These landings were unopposed. A secure land base is being consolidated. During the night, several landings and raids were made by our forces in different parts of the Falkland Islands. Some of these forces have remained ashore. Argentine forces have suffered casualties, and some prisoners have been taken. These operations continue. As we expected, our ships have come under heavy air attack. 5 have been damaged, 2 seriously. There will have been British casualties, but we have no details. Our Harriers and missiles have destroyed 7 Mirage, 5 Skyhawks, and 2 Pucaras. 2 Argentine helicopters, a Chinook and a Puma, have been destroyed on the ground. We have lost 2 of our small helicopters. 7 weeks after the Argentine aggression, British forces are tonight firmly established back on the Falkland Islands. I will make a fuller statement tomorrow and take questions at that time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
D-Day, 21st of May, Friday. By dawn and first light, we could see the ships around us, 21 of them, warships, troop carriers, supply ships, ammunition ships, the civilian seconded ships, the Canberra, nicknamed the Wedding Cake, the ocean-going tugs, the North Sea ferry Norland, the odd collection of ships that made up the British invasion force. With the troops, upwards of 5,000 of them ashore on the main beachheads, the landing craft began ferrying the heavy supplies, fuel, food, artillery pieces, shells, ammunition, and water, especially water. There is very little of it here. And above them, helicopters flew backwards and forwards between the ships and between the ships and the beaches, a field gun slung beneath them, or a Land Rover, or a box of ammunition, or a Rapier air defense system, much respected here. So much was happening so quickly. San Carlos water was suddenly noisy with the business of war. Then suddenly, as we'd all been expecting, the first Argentine aircraft, Pucaras and Skyhawks, and later Mirage fighter bombers, swooped low over the hills to the side of us. They were strafing and firing missiles and throwing, literally throwing from their underbelly 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs at the first ship they saw as they came in from the mainland at over 500 miles an hour. Bombs dropped into the sea in front of us. 2 fell either side of the Canberra. Such a target she was, brilliant white in the afternoon sun. Our warships, the destroyers and frigates around us, protecting us, fired off their guns and their missiles, the Sea Cats and Sea Wolves. Through my binoculars, I watched one missile fired from an assault ship chase and then hit a missile fired from a Mirage. We survived that day and pulled out at dusk with a number of other supply ships, including the Canberra. It was too vulnerable, too white, too much of a target. We were to stand off in open sea and wait a day to see if the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force Harrier jets couldn't reduce the risk of a repeat of these air attacks. So we sailed back into San Carlos water. More ships came in with us. We were accompanied by Antelope, the frigate. They'd all come in from the Falklands Sound for the protection of the hills either side of the bay. Canberra, though, did not return. Part of our Sunday was spent delivering the post sent in from Britain via the Ascension Island. It has been said, I know, 1,000 times before, but there really is no tonic like a letter from home. Our mail service was not only to the ship's crews, but also to the troops now ashore. And they ran out from their foxholes, their faces still blackened, but their noses now red with the cold. And cold on the Falklands means very cold. And still, there were more air attacks. How the British task force commanders have underestimated the determination of the Argentine pilots who managed to guide their planes past our air combat patrol Harriers, past the guns and missiles in the Falkland Sound to push through their attacks. That Sunday afternoon was our worst. A 1,000-pounder dropped less than 50 yards from us, and the ship shuddered. It also dropped 50 yards from an ammunition ship, still packed with its cargo. And then, so much worse. First, the frigate Ardent was sunk, then Argonaut was hit and crippled, so crippled she couldn't move. Then in front of us, 400 yards away, Antelope, who had escorted us in that morning, took 2 bombs. One went straight through her, the second hit her midships. For some reason we couldn't understand then, seemed to be well. She steamed past us to a new anchorage, and we could see the holes either side of her hull. Then, a little before 10 that evening, British time, she suddenly exploded as men were working on the bomb damage. Flames touched off her weapon systems, her ammunition, and her fuel. Helicopters went in again and again to take the men off. We could just see them, and pilots described later how the crew of Antelope stood calmly in lines on the flight deck, waiting to be lifted off to safety, their ship exploding behind them. And we could see the searchlights and flares as helicopters and landing craft searched the water around Antelope for survivors. And the next morning, 24th of May, burnt out, gutted, a final explosion broke her back. She split in 2, and as the red-hot deck and superstructure touched the water, steam and smoke mixed and billowed up across San Carlos Bay. Antelope was gone. But there are men in this task force who need to be oblivious to the casualties of war, and these men carried on with the enormous and continuing job of unloading supplies from the ships. Food, water, thousands of tons of ammunition, all the guns and all the weapons and all the artillery that needed to be pushed upwards towards Port Stanley. Landing craft ferried backwards and forward from the ships to the beaches from dawn to dusk, only scattering to the protection of the coves and inlets whenever the air alerts sounded. And they did, again and again, day after day. 25th of May, the 5th day of our arrival, and also Argentine National Independence Day. A bad omen? In a war like this, such anniversaries become suddenly and of course absurdly important, but such is our superstition. Up on the decks now, almost as an afterthought, general-purpose machine guns have been mounted by Royal Marines commandos as additional air defense. Odd, we thought, with so many millions of pounds worth of missiles around us, that such a makeshift weaponry should be necessary. But fired together and in the same direction, and a pilot would have to fly through a wall of lead. The Marines claimed at least 1 Mirage that day. 4 Mirages attacked us that afternoon, 3 went down. The pilot ejected in front of us. A landing craft brought him back to the ship that he'd tried a few minutes before to destroy. He was badly injured with cuts and a broken leg. And the Naval Surgeon Commander, Douglas White, said the man had flown jets for the last time.
He ejected from his aircraft, pulled into the ship by one of our landing boats. He has got a complete fore and aft dislocation of his left knee, probably rupturing some of his thigh muscle. He had a dislocated left kneecap patella bone, which I've reduced the dislocation. We've now wrapped him up. He's got a nasty lot of bleeding around the joint. He will probably be in plaster for 2 to 3 months, I think, at the minimum, if they don't operate on him immediately.
What's going to happen to him now?
Well, I believe he'll be very lucky if he's flying jet aircraft again, but of course his skills are such that he may well be able to fly non-jet aircraft. I suspect, you see, that he did that ejecting through the hatchway of the canopy of the aircraft.
Despite the rain, it was the biggest march so far organised by the Falkland Islands Ad Hoc Peace Committee, made up of 17 Labour MPs and some 30 church and peace organisations. A huge police presence flanked the march throughout and intervened when some marchers broke ranks in Hyde Park and to quieten outbursts from the few anti-peace demonstrators who lined the route. But with news of the landings by the task force dominating people's thoughts today, I asked Mr. Ben whether the rally wasn't inopportune.
We're here for peace. We're here to save further lives being lost. And there are millions of people in Britain who agree with what we're saying. And what you're saying really is that in a situation like this, we should wind up our democracy. Well, I don't believe in that. That's what they do in the Argentine. I believe in people speaking their minds.
The committee chairman, Judith Hart, spoke at the rally in Trafalgar Square, calling for the immediate withdrawal of British forces and promising to keep up the momentum of demonstration until they do. Sue Lloyd-Roberts, ITN, Trafalgar Square.
Firstly, Secretary of State, can I ask you to tell us about this bad news?
Well, in the last hour or two, there's been quite a significant, a major attack on our ships. And I'm afraid the bad news is that one of our ships has been badly damaged and she's in difficulty. I can't give any further details at this moment. The news is still coming in about her. But clearly, from what we know at the moment, it is bad news, and I should say that straight away.
Is there any information about casualties, possible casualties?
No, there is no information about casualties at the moment, but as soon as we've got further details, we will naturally give them.
Was this another air attack?
This was an air attack, a mass air attack. We did expect the Argentinians to launch attacks on our ships today. It's their national day, and I think we were anticipating a mass raid of the kind that has clearly materialized in the last few hours.
This is a warship that's been hit and not a transport ship.
I don't want to say anything more at the moment because the news is still coming in.
We've had 3 ships lost so far,
Yes.
and this ship is badly damaged. You said that losses were expected, but did you expect
Yes.
this many?
Well, I don't think any of us made precise estimates, but we knew that this was going to be a hazardous operation, and I've been warning that about the possibility of casualties since the task force set out 6 weeks ago. It's an incredibly difficult operation at enormous distance. We've got more than 100 ships involved and more than 26,000 men and women. So that we were bound to have casualties. Naturally, every single ship that is hit is a great disaster for us. There's no point in hiding that. And human casualties are a tragedy. But we are fighting for freedom and democracy against unprovoked aggression, and we must stick to it. And we have our troops ashore. We've completed the most hazardous part of the landing operation. We have large numbers ashore, and now we're going forward to repossess the island, as I said yesterday.
But does this mean, if we've completed the landing part, does this mean
Yes.
the ships close to the land can now be withdrawn and therefore be safe?
Well, we've still been building up supplies. Supply ships have been going in, landing more supplies, and that process is bound to continue. We will still have to resupply the men on the ground with ammunition and food, but there is plenty there for the next few weeks. But there are other items of equipment still to be brought ashore.
Our reporter with the task force said on News at 10 tonight that Britain may have underestimated the Argentine Air Force resolve, if necessary, to die for their cause. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think that the Argentinian pilots are showing great bravery. It would be foolish of me to suggest anything else. They're showing considerable bravery. They've lost over 50 fixed-wing aircraft. We've shot down another 3 combat aircraft today. And the losses from the Argentine Navy and Air Force are tremendous, and they cannot go on sustaining this level of losses for very much longer. But they're clearly brave pilots, and I think we should recognize that.
But our naval losses are greater than theirs. How long can we go on sustaining this rate of loss?
Well, our naval losses have been greater because we've bottled up their navy in port and it hasn't showed up. As soon as their navy comes out to fight, I would suspect that their naval losses will be very great indeed, but they're lurking around inshore where we can't get at them, and they're not taking any part in the battle.
But can we afford to go on losing ships at the rate that we have been?
Well, clearly, I would not like to lose a single ship. But as I said in the House of Commons yesterday, we've had more ships joining the fleet in the last 48 hours, considerably more ships joining the fleet in the last 40 hours than those that we have lost so far. So we have enough ships, and we've been bringing in replacements, more than compensating for the ships that we've lost so far.
But the fact that our ships seem to be so vulnerable to low-level air attack, does it indicate that they haven't got the right defensive weapons on board?
Well, it's not our ships are vulnerable to low-level air attack. All ships, all surface ships are vulnerable to low-level air attack. The Type 42s, of course, have an area defense weapon, the Sea Dart, and that is what they're intended to do. They were built and designed to form an outer ring. As you know, the Type 22s and others have Seawolf, which is an anti-missile missile. It was not possible or ever considered an option to place Seawolf on the Type 42s as well as Sea Dart, but the two ships are intended to perform different functions.
But for future reference,
yes.
Will the design of future ships be changed in order to accommodate more effective self-defensive systems?
Well, obviously, as a result of the lessons we learn, we will look at ship design, and I'm sure that everybody will be very anxious to draw every conceivable lesson from this episode. But I think that the Type 42 is an area defense system. The Type 22 is an anti-submarine warfare ship. And we mustn't confuse the two. You can't get an all-purpose frigate that does everything. And I think people must understand that.
Two of the ships that have been lost have been
Yes.
Type 21 frigates,
Yes.
which apparently have burned vigorously.
Yes.
And this is possibly partly because they have an aluminium superstructure.
Yes.
Is that some warning for the future about ship design?
Well, I'm not a ship designer, and the argument against steel and aluminium has raged for years. The arguments for aluminium are that it makes for a lighter ship, and therefore you can get more stability and more weapons on the ship. And indeed, the Americans have many aluminium framed ships, so that it isn't just a quirk of ours, and there are advantages in building ships with aluminium. But clearly we must look at this and see whether it was the right thing to have done. The Type 21s, as you realise, were a commercial type vessel built by British shipbuilders, and they've been successful. But maybe we should look to see whether a different kind of design would be desirable for the Type 23, which will be our next class of frigates.
The United States Secretary of State, Mr. Hague, has talked today about intense British military activity on the Falklands, and he said that he expects results soon. Do you agree with that?
I expect that now that we're ashore and we have all our equipment and heavy stores ashore, that the level of activity on the ground will build up fairly quickly and fairly soon. Yes, I would expect that to happen.
Does that mean that the British force will soon be confronting Stanley, the main Argentine garrison?
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on that. The options on the ground are something for the commander on the spot, and certainly not something that I think we should announce in advance.
But could the situation arise where the Argentines defend their garrison at Stanley extremely strongly, and for Britain to win, a very high level of loss of life would be necessary, and perhaps that would be unacceptable, and there could be a stalemate? Could you envisage such a situation?
I don't see any purpose in always looking on the worst side of every situation. So far, this operation has gone extremely well. It's been a remarkable achievement to get 100 ships and 25,000 men across the world successfully landed without losing a single person on the actual landing itself. We've taken South Georgia without any loss of life. We've bottled up the Argentine Navy. It has been, I may say it's not due to me, it's due to the great skill of the services. It has been a remarkable achievement, which I think the whole world has admired. Now, you ask me, how will it go from here? I hope it goes as well as it's gone so far. Naturally, I would wish not to lose a single life or a single extra ship or piece of equipment. But I fear that we will have further losses. It's no use pretending in a battle of this sort we won't sustain them.
But you're confident that Britain can recapture Port Stanley?
I'm absolutely confident. With time, we have enormously skilled and professional troops on the ground. 5 Brigade, another 3,000 men are on their way, not many days away. The Harrier has proved itself a superb aircraft against the Mirage and the Skyhawk. Things won't all go our way. I really do make that clear. But I have no doubt at all that within a period of time we will achieve all our objectives and the Union Jack will be flying again in Port Stanley.
Mr. Nott, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have received further reports overnight about the outcome of yesterday's Argentine air attacks on the task force. HMS Coventry, a destroyer, was hit and has been lost. The Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant ship requisitioned to support the fleet, was also hit and has had to be abandoned. The Harrier reinforcements she was carrying for the task force had already been disembarked. Rescue operations to recover the crew of these 2 ships have continued throughout the night. As we get information on casualties, we are informing the next of kin. The Secretary of State for Defense will be making a statement this afternoon in Parliament. Thank you.
By the skill of our pilots, our sailors, and those manning the Rapier missiles on shore, they have inflicted heavy losses on the Argentine Air Force. Over 50 aircraft have been destroyed. There have, of course, been tragic losses, and you will have heard of the further attacks on our task force. HMS Coventry came under repeated air attack yesterday evening and later sank. One of our merchant ships supporting the task force, the Atlantic Conveyor, was also damaged and had to be abandoned. We do not yet know the number of casualties, but our hearts go out to all those families who had men in these ships. But despite these grievous losses, neither our resolve nor our confidence is weakened. We in Britain know the reality of war. We know its hazards and its dangers. We know the task that faces our fighting men. They are now established on the Falkland Islands with all the necessary supplies. And although they still face formidable problems in difficult terrain with a hostile climate, their morale is high. We must expect fresh attacks upon them, and there can be no question of pressing the force commander to move forward prematurely. The judgment about timing must be his and his alone, and we have confidence in his judgment. The Falkland Islands are British. The Falkland Islanders are British. They don't want to be ruled by Argentina, as those pictures of the welcome given to the British Marines and soldiers showed more clearly than 1,000 words. It's been suggested that the size of the Falkland Islands and the comparatively small number of its inhabitants, some 1,800 men, women, and children, should somehow affect our reaction to what has happened to them. To those, not many, who speak lightly of a few islanders beyond the seas and who ask the question, are the few worth fighting for? Let me say this. Right and wrong are not measured by a head count of those to whom that wrong has been done. That would not be principle, but expediency. And the Falklanders, remember, are not strangers. They are our own people. Madam Chairman, our cause is just. It is the cause of freedom and the rule of law. It is the cause of support for the weak against aggression by the strong. Let us then draw together in the name not of jingoism, but of justice. Finally, let our nation, as it has so often in the past, remind itself and the world, naught shall make us rue, if England to herself do rest but true.
At first light, the full extent of the horror of the fighting became apparent. The thick gorse that had hidden Argentine bunkers was still ablaze or smoking after what had been a furious battle. Some of the Argentine wounded huddled together in the burnt-out brush, exhausted, shocked and bemused, beyond caring about pain from their injuries. As the smoke and mist curled around them, it was impossible to feel anything but pity for them. Some died as they waited, the first aid offered quickly by the paratroopers not coming in time. The worst of the wounded were ferried back to the British military hospital as quickly as helicopters could be released to carry them. Men who'd been trying to kill each other less than an hour before now joined together to help the wounded.
¿Cuándo días? ¿Cuándo días? Dos días. 2 days ago. Mortar? Yeah. Yeah, can you just ask if it's just the one? Is it just the one injury?
Solamente este. ¿Tiene más? No. No, no es aquí la que no. Aquí solamente este.
The proud boast of the medical team here was that every patient who arrived alive went out alive. and I spoke to the man who'd set up the hospital, Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly.
Commander, what's been the major problem in setting up a medical facility like this on shore?
The fact is that normally with hospitals you have lots of clean areas and lots of space and lots of light. All we've had here is a refrigeration plant that's been disused for the last 30 years. But we had to take it, it was dry, and we simply got on with it.
Now, how successful has it been?
Well, we hope always in war that we're never busy at all, but we have been busy, as you know. The casualties have come in large numbers in 3 separate incidents. And I won't give you any figures, but I'm proud to say that thanks to the combined efforts of the naval surgeons and the army surgeons and the Royal Marines that support them, everyone that's come in here alive, despite their horrible wounds, has gone out alive, and they're now on Uganda.
Inevitably, at an occasion like this, there have been many lessons learned because it's never been done quite like this before. What were the major ones for you?
Well, the lessons learned are flexibility and good humor and a willingness to work. And if we had to do this again, I'd like the same team, and I'd like just a few more stores so that we didn't have to worry about running out of stores with casualties still waiting to be treated.
But so far the casualties haven't had to wait too long, have they?
Absolutely. Even the enemy we've operated on during the night when the air attacks have ceased. The other interesting thing is, of course, we've got 2 unexploded bombs in the building, but we've lived with those for so long now we've almost forgotten about them. I've just been to look at one, and well, the less said about that, the better.
For the civilians, their release hadn't come a moment too soon, and they showed it. For 29 days, they'd been kept in a small community hall, all 114 of them, often without hot food or sanitary arrangements. Now they were free to welcome the paras before starting up their lives again, and it was a welcome much appreciated by both sides. And then, much later on, a lonely hillside overlooking San Carlos water was the position for the funeral of the British. It was a somber, formal and moving event. 18 men laid to rest 8,000 miles from home. Their colleagues mourned and prayed there wouldn't be many more.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan, Corporal Pryor, Lance Corporal Thorpe, Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman Smith, Private Fletcher, Private Illingsworth, Private Meakin, Private Dixon. From 3 Commando Brigade Air Squadron, Lieutenant Nunn. From 5-9 Commando Royal Engineers, Corporal Melia. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Amen.
The ships of the fleet stood guard in the quiet, deep waters of San Carlos water as 5 Brigade came ashore in the cold dawn of Sunday, May the 30th. Among them, the Gurkhas, swarming south to guard the brigade's rear against possible surprise attack. Overhead, pilots ferried artillery pieces and other equipment in a constant shuttle to the forward positions. And as the day wore on, landing craft brought in more men and more supplies. Forklift trucks were unloaded and immediately put to work to unload thousands of boxes of food. Each pack of concentrated food will feed 10 men for a day, and there are some 9,000 men to be fed.
Only all of one tragedy, we're all this guys. It's gonna last you a week.
For the commander of the British Land Forces, Major General Jeremy Moore in the peaked cap, it's a massive logistical exercise because apart from feeding the troops, tactics have to be worked out, positions consolidated. And for the men, that means filling sandbags and endless digging. Inevitably, the bad weather combined with all the paraphernalia of conventional war turned the country roads into ankle-deep mudslides. This snowcat is heading for the front line and high ground. The Marines too were heading for the marshlands and the mountains. There was little time for rest. Their objective, Teal Inlet, lay 20 miles away and needed to be taken with speed. So they set off on foot, in full battle order, eastwards into the mist. If they were exhausted when they arrived, it said much for their fitness and stamina, for the march was just the beginning. Overhead, Sea King and Wessex helicopters brought in yet more supplies from the bridgehead at San Carlos, from food to artillery. It meant hours of toil and sweat, for each artillery piece had to be dug in and camouflaged. And when that was done, the men had to dig more trenches, defensive positions, for themselves. As they fought back the tiredness and bore the discomforts of rough living, mentally they prepared themselves for yet more miles of marching, more cold, wet nights on the mountain, and for the battle which lay ahead, the battle for Port Stanley.
The casualties of war were quick coming. The trickle of the first few days became a flood. Helicopters shuttled them into the field hospital at Ajax Bay, from first light to last. Treatment, and then quickly on to the hospital ship Uganda standing out at sea. The hospital at Ajax is set up in a derelict meat refrigeration plant, and for the first few days it was ideal, as any emergency field hospital can be in these conditions. On Thursday, 27th of May in the evening, Argentine Skyhawks bombed the base. A 1,000-pound bomb went straight through the field hospital, exploding on an ammunition dump beyond.
Those that had to be operated on straight away were operated on, and the surgeons did their cutting wearing tin hats. And every time an air raid alert sounded, non-essential staff went out, and patients on trestles were lowered to the floor, but the surgeons carried on cutting.
The British are finding it almost as difficult to cope with our prisoners, upwards of 1,600 now. In gloomy procession, they filed in from Darwin and Goose Green, where they'd been kept in a sheep pen in the days following the Second Paris victory, and they came by pontoon helicopter landing craft, uniformly cold, miserable, hungry. Goose Green is remembered, in my mind's eye at least, by 1,500 helmets scattered across the airfield, the remains of the surrender by the Argentine garrison 2 days before. Goose Green is to be remembered certainly by its open-air napalm factory. There it was, in the middle of the village, 32 100-gallon drop tanks made in the Argentine and filled with the evil stuff ready to be dropped from bomb carriers of the Pucara aircraft on the airstrip. And at the edge of the airstrip, close to where the Pucaras had been parked, we saw another 57 drop tanks. These were more crudely made, almost as if they'd been welded together in a hurry. And Goose Green will be remembered for other things that ran counter to familiar Argentine propaganda. These people, 114 of them, residents of the village and from the few farms around, were locked in this tiny church hall, not more than 200 yards from where the napalm drop tanks had been filled. And they were locked there for 1 month. And while they were imprisoned in the hall, the Argentine officers moved into their houses, emptying the larders and fridges, ransacking and destroying what couldn't be used, contaminating with urine and excreta wherever they chose.
que tus enemigos te cercarán con un muro, te sitiarán y te atacarán por todas partes, te arrasarán.
Señor Brigadier General don Basilio Arturo Ignacio Lamidoso.
Ayer se trataba de aventar de nuestros ríos la presencia del oponente que amenazaba nuestra incipiente libertad como nación.
You don't accept that there's any chance of failure?
Failure? In what way?
Losing the war.
It doesn't mind if we lose the war, but we are winning.
What would happen if you lose the war, say, to the junta? Would it be able to remain in power?
But of course. Of course, I have no doubt of that. Evidently, people will integrate themselves more than before.
What would happen to Galtieri if you lost the Malvinas?
We go on loving him because he is great. Thank you. Bye.
Today's dispatches describe the full horror and the reality of war. A makeshift field hospital, British surgeons fighting to save the lives of Argentine casualties, flown in from the battlefield. Some of those young Argentine soldiers, it seems, had been left untended by their own side and had to be treated for wounds 3 days old. Richard Saville of the Press Association visited the hospital, a disused refrigeration plant, and learned that surgical teams had just carried out their 100th major operation since the fighting began. All the casualties that he saw, he said, were Argentine soldiers. All told, 220 men had been treated, and 2 Argentine doctors captured in the fighting were being called in to help. As the teams worked in the dust and in the poor light, Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly paid tribute to his men. Despite the horrors of modern warfare, he said, it is our proud boast here that everyone who has come in alive has gone out alive to the hospital ship Uganda. There are some incredible pieces of surgery. In fact, the teams carried out 12 amputations in those awful conditions, and always it seemed more men in blood-soaked bandages were waiting. One of them was an Argentine pilot. Commander Jolly told Kim Sabido of IRN how he came to be there.
He was attacking the fleet yesterday and got a missile right up his chuff, and he was very lucky indeed. He ejected at extremely low level, realizing his aircraft was breaking up, and was in the air for a very short time before he hit the water. He was injured in the ejection, was recovered from the sea, and taken to one of the ships where he was given some morphine and his leg was splintered, and he was brought ashore here to the surgeons, the surgical facility we have ashore, and was operated on last night. It's almost paradoxical that he should be trying to blat us one day and dependent on our medical facilities the next.
Richard Saville, the Press Association man, also described the misery of the Argentine prisoners. Armed soldiers guarded the square pen, he wrote. The prisoners were together, jumping up and down in the mud to protect themselves from the icy wind. Some smoked cigarettes, an Argentine brand. Other correspondents in pooled reports described the bridgehead at San Carlos, a once-a-year sheep-shearing station which has now lost the last vestiges of its civilian existence to become a garrison town. Farmers ferry troops and munitions around on their tractors, just about the only vehicles which survive the foot-deep mud which clogs the main paths, while womenfolk carry plastic buckets of tea and soup around from one gun emplacement to another. Teenagers on scramble motorcycles run messages between sections, covering the rugged ground much quicker than could a military runner. And the report went on. There is hardly a moment of peace in this beautiful but barren place. Helicopters chatter overhead, tanks and bulldozers roar. There is the continual crump of mortars being bedded in the hillside and the crackle of machine guns aimed at jets flashing overhead. I asked Jeremy Hands, who went into Goose Green with 2 para, if he thought the British had underestimated the Argentine troops.
Yes, I do. I've seen 1,400 Argentine prisoners. We've been told that they were badly supplied, that they were badly clothed, and that they were in very bad heart. In fact, their clothing is every bit as good as the British. They have quilted suits. Their supplies were good. They were modern. Their weapons were good. They had plenty of ammunition, and they knew how to use it. The one thing that I can say, though, is that their morale is very, very low now. I've spoken to them. It's very difficult to find a ray of hope in an army that's just been beaten. But the 1,500 men at Goose Green, first of all, obviously believed when they were taken and their surrender was accepted that they were going to be shot. Their officers apparently had been telling them that there's no point in surrendering to the British because they will torture you and kill you. And when they found out that that was not going to be the case, the relief on their faces was incredible to see. A lot of them burst into tears. Many of them fell on their knees and started praying. It was a very, very moving experience. The Argentine prisoners were, as I left Goose Green, some hours after the battle, were quite willingly carrying stores around for the Paras. They were also being involved in clearing up their own minefields, which they hadn't marked. And it was a job that they weren't very keen on undertaking because they had put mines around Goose Green, and they hadn't marked them, and the Paras simply told them to go and clear them up. But the horror of coming through into Goose Green and seeing the effect of white phosphorus grenades, mortar shells on the dead and the wounded was something which I could never ever forget.
Now, with the bridgehead well established, British troops are even getting the odd luxury. A staff sergeant in charge of supplies is quoted as saying, "We are short only of whiskey and women. We've even been able to supply them with sweets and biscuits, extra socks and foot powder." It might not seem like luxury to you, he said, but to a man living in a hole in the ground, it's very welcome.
Progress up the River Plate to a safe port had been closely watched by the Argentines. She couldn't risk straying into their territorial waters. Attention was focused on this arrival, the first hospital ship to come from the battle zone. The Uruguayans arranged for a Red Cross team to board during the night, and the doctors were satisfied that conditions complied with the Geneva Convention. Armed Uruguayan troops ringed the area while final negotiations to release the Argentines and transfer the wounded began. Both sides declined the offer of immediate transfer to local hospitals by ambulance. At least 2 men among the British casualties were able to walk about and limped happily on deck. The 24 prisoners came off first. They were from the fishing vessel Narwhal, which was attacked by British planes as a spy ship 3 weeks ago. The British watched them leave, while officials from 3 countries completed the dockside handover and gave permission for them to be transferred by coach to their own ship just 50 yards away. It was all very carefully planned. And from the Hecla crew, who've been at sea for many weeks, there were some messages we couldn't read, but another plain enough. They carried with them some seriously injured who were casualties from naval engagements.
Well, some of them burnt. Some of them have got things as minor as a broken ankle.
Are there any serious casualties among them?
It's very difficult for me to say, but I'm sure you can assume that there are some who are serious. But they're all stable and are able to be moved.
An RAF VC-10 fitted out as a flying hospital will take them home later tonight. The aircraft brought 6 tons of urgent medical supplies for Hecla and the other hospital ships, but customs men at the airport insisted on opening each box before allowing them through. But it gave time for Hecla's helicopter crew to make use of the calmer waters to maintain their machine. Meanwhile, as the numbers of casualties rise, this port is expected to become a major reception centre for the wounded and captured. Brent Sadler, News at 10, Montevideo.
Just if you would just kindly sit there, and then they can use it, as you know, for 10 seconds just to establish that we were sitting in the same room. It adds importance to the interview. Prime Minister, do you expect an early conclusion to the Falklands crisis?
One always hopes for an early conclusion. One's learned throughout this whole Falklands campaign that things tend to take longer than you expect.
Do you think diplomacy has got a part to play now?
I think a decision to withdraw troops on the part of the Argentines may have a part to play. They haven't withdrawn them for the last 7 weeks. I always thought it would be difficult for a dictator to withdraw, but it is always just possible that at the very last minute he might think that they have their backs to the sea and that he would quite like to avoid what could be a prolonged and difficult battle for all our people.
Is there anything you can do to encourage him?
I don't think there's anything more I can do. As you know, we made up our own terms and published them. They were quite clear about how far we were prepared to go to avoid a conflict and avoid loss of life. Everything but everything has been turned down. There is just a possibility now, but I don't rate it very highly.
You've been told to be magnanimous in any victory. What does magnanimous mean to you?
It is not a word I use in connection with the Falklands, in connection with a battle on the Falklands. Sometimes I think people are using it to say, all right, hand something to the Argentines. Under these circumstances, to an invader and an aggressor and a military dictator, that would not be magnanimity. It would be treachery or betrayal of our own people. We couldn't betray our own people.
There is a view that one should not humiliate one's opponent. That merely makes life difficult for everyone.
I'm not trying to humiliate anyone. I'm just trying to repossess islands which are British sovereign territory for people who are British to have British administration, to live their own way of life under a government of their own choice. That's not humiliation. That is liberty, justice, and democracy.
You've said before that the wishes of the islanders should be paramount. Is paramount still the right word?
Self-determination is the right word. We have it here. The United States have it. All democracies have it. Where you have an island that is peopled, has been peopled for a very long time, and after all, the British people didn't displace any indigenous population. They went there, some of them have been there for 7 generations. What we are concerned with there is that they shall be able to continue the way of life which they've had.
The idea of some sort of shared sovereignty with Argentina has been taken up and at least discussed by governments. Is that in the back of your mind now?
No. I don't believe for one moment that after what people have experienced, they would see Argentine government as playing any part in their future. They didn't want it before. They would not even consider a very long lease of, say, 250 years. They said no. We want to stay with our British way of life. Now that they have experienced what it's like to live with the Argentines on the island, I think that their hostility to the Argentine will be even greater.
It would be surprising if there were not divisions of opinion among your own advisers about what happens after the military action is over. How serious are those divisions?
Divisions of opinion, I know. What we are trying to do now, 2 things, well, 3 things really. First, when the islands have been repossessed, and there's still, as you say, a very big, it could be lengthy battle ahead if the Argentines don't withdraw, that has to be completed and the islands repossessed. We are now thinking of the rehabilitation, repair, reconstruction, and development that must take place. That will take quite a time. I have asked Lord Shackleton, who did a wonderful report in 1976, which, alas, we did not fully follow up, to update his proposals in the light of present circumstances so that we will have something to go on to develop the resources of those islands. Thirdly, we'll then have to consider the whole future with the Falkland Islanders, whether we can bring them to full independence or some kind of self-government. And fourthly, we'll have to try to get some arrangements for the security of the Falkland Islands. We will have to stay there for some time, but we will want some other help from other nations. After all, when the United States asked us to go and join them with a multinational force in Sinai, we did it. That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking of. We said yes to them, and I think that they are naturally interested, and I think perhaps they and some other nations would help. It's very important that we get security for the Falkland Islands and for the Falkland Islanders if we're to get the capital to go there, to develop the islands, to give greater opportunities for the people. So we have the immediate problem, the repossession, and all of the other things we are thinking of. Oh, there are variations in view, there are many things that you can do, but not fundamental differences of opinion in any way, only how can we best do it?
Would you consider a part for the United Nations, say, in the future supervision of the security of the islands?
That would be possible, but I think once we have repossessed the islands, I think it may be possible to do it by a multinational force of the kind which I have indicated.
It is suggested that Argentina might not accept a military defeat, would simply go on trying to bomb the islands, and thereby wait and prepare until Britain was caught napping again.
That is exactly why we are spending some considerable amount of time on thinking how best to secure the future of the islands. They would have to be secured against invasion by sea or invasion by air. And I think why it's important to have more than one nation involved in their security.
Would you think of a military base there, which a number of nations might use?
Well, we had a very, very tiny little garrison. Obviously, there has to be far more there than there was in the past. You have to think of the two things: protection against invasion by sea, and of course I believe that we'll have to lengthen the airstrip. As a matter of fact, if we had lengthened the airstrip before and it had not been defended, the invasion would have been even easier. But let me put it this way: we're very much aware of the problem. It mustn't happen again. We shall not be able to get the capital to develop the many resources that we could develop. And we have to consider how to do it first with other nations, a possible United Nations force, but the United Nations is already very heavily involved in various parts of the world. So if we could do it through a multinational force, I think that would be the best thing.
What do you think of the United States' part in this crisis so far? Has America really been a good ally?
The United States is as staunch in the principles of liberty, justice and democracy as the United Kingdom. And in her heart of hearts she knew, and always knew, that there could never be any neutrality between a military junta and democracy. What she had hoped to do was to try to secure a peaceful settlement, including the withdrawal of Argentine forces without a battle. We're very grateful to her for making that effort. It was not her fault that it did not succeed. It was the fault of the Argentines. She made the effort, we tried too. The Secretary General of the United Nations made the effort, but he could not succeed in getting the Argentines to withdraw in accordance with that resolution. The fault lies not with the United States, nor with the Secretary General. Their efforts were splendid. It lies with an invader who is determined to try to keep the fruits of invasion as a condition of withdrawal. That was and remains totally unacceptable to us.
And do you think our European partners have behaved as true allies should?
They were absolutely splendid right at the beginning when they agreed to put on a ban against Argentine imports, agreed not to export any military equipment. They acted swiftly. It helped tremendously, along with the United Nations resolution, to make it clear to the world that we were right and the Argentine was wrong. It's as clear-cut as that. We are right, they are wrong. We are the victims, they are the aggressors. And I think they have behaved extremely well. Of course, we were disappointed that neither Italy nor Ireland cooperated to the full in extending those sanctions. But we're very grateful for the others for remaining staunch and true. And France and Germany led, and Holland were led on this, but they didn't have any difficulty in getting the others to follow.
Have you changed your mind about the media's coverage of the Falklands?
I had one or two rather acid things to say about certain programs. I noticed that other people had acid things to say about those particular programs. May I say that I think since then it is very much better. I think in the early days there was a problem. I think some of your people didn't fully realize that if you were fighting a battle in South Georgia and so on, we hadn't perhaps made provision for getting photographs home. We thought the most important thing was to win the battles, to repossess, and we hadn't put the equipment down there to get photographs home. Undoubtedly, in the early days, that caused a problem, because we were getting the actual news, but we weren't getting the photographs, and you were getting them from the Argentine, which was much closer. I hope the cooperation is very much better now. It was our decision, you know, to put correspondents on board the ships I think some of them have been very, very helpful indeed and given very, very vivid accounts and helped us to know what is going on. So I hope all is working well. We all stand for the same things. We all believe in the same things. And you couldn't do without that liberty, which is part of our tradition.
Finally, do you think that the bodies of the British forces should be brought home for burial?
I know that there's quite a lot of strong feeling about this, and I think the other side has been put today that usually these soldiers are buried on the field of battle, that while the battle is on, I think everyone understands that the important thing is to try to win it. And then wherever we've been, we've had the most wonderful Commonwealth cemeteries, which are looked after beautifully. I have visited some, and they're looked after forever. And honor is done to each and every person who has fallen in a separate grave. And of course, one always tries to enable the relatives to go there. The sailors are buried at sea, and the aircraftmen where they fall. If, however, people do feel very strongly, then of course we'd have to take their feelings into account. If most of them feel that the tradition should obtain, it will be honoured with great dignity. And if they want to go and see, as of course they would, so would I, we'll manage, with the help of the Treasury and the MOD, to get them there, to reassure them. And of course the Falkland Islanders would give them a wonderful welcome, because they know the sacrifices that have been made for them. And I would just like the relatives to know why their loved ones fell. They fell in the cause of liberty, justice, and democracy.
Thank you very much.
If the original Argentine claims about the narwhal were to be believed, then we were about to witness a remarkable sight. The men about to disembark for a reunion with their families were, according to official communiques, supposed to have been shot out of their lifeboats and abandoned to their fate in the water. Today they looked well enough, clearly proof of British claims that they'd been picked out of the water and taken to safety. At the time, the incident was given much prominence here as an example of British atrocity. Magazines carried graphic impressions of how the defenseless crew had been strafed again and again in their lifeboats by the British Harrier which sunk their boat. The Argentines even produced a last dramatic message from the narwhal's captain saying, "We're all about to die for our country." But today, one of the crew confirmed to me that he'd been well treated by the British after the initial attack.
In time.
Y después de todo eso,
After all that,
nos vinieron a buscar en helicóptero,
they
nos
came as to
llevaron
fetch us in helicopters and they took us, ¿a dónde?
a Invencible.
¿A dónde? They took us to the Invincible.
In the attack, only one man died. The rest arrived safely home today. In the fear and confusion, they may have thought their lifeboats were being fired on, and details like that make good propaganda for a country at war.
As things get tougher for the Argentines, so the propaganda war continues to hot up. Further claims of British atrocities are sure to follow. Indeed, they're already being made. One of the most popular newspapers here couldn't bear to tell its readers that 250 Argentines had died in combat on the islands. Here's their headline this morning: British assassins massacre prisoners. Ken Rees, News at 10, Buenos Aires.
It's been known for some time that Argentina's Latin American neighbours have been supplying her with some spares and equipment, including Mirage aircraft. But this latest news that Argentina might have acquired more sophisticated weaponry will obviously be of some concern to Ministry of Defence officials. It's thought the Argentines might have acquired more air-launched missiles, including possibly the French-built Exocet. But Whitehall sources say there's also reason to be concerned that Argentina may already have been supplied with Israeli Gabriel missiles. Gabriel is an anti-ship missile which is usually launched from another ship, but there's speculation that an air-launched version may have been developed. The fear in London is that with an improved arsenal, Argentina may be tempted to mount hit-and-run raids on British forces if the Argentine garrison at Port Stanley is defeated. And exactly when British forces will move against that Argentine garrison still remains a matter of speculation. In the area of Britain's most advanced positions on Two Sisters Ridge, just 7 miles from the centre of Port Stanley, it's reported to be bitterly cold with fog and sporadic sleet. So far, British forces are still moving heavy equipment up to the front line, but the poor visibility has meant something of a respite from the continuing British bombardment for 8,000 or so Argentine troops now thought to be dug in around the capital. In the most recent dispatches from correspondents with the task force, Leslie Dowd of Reuters writes of a red-roofed farm where Falklanders from up to 30 miles away gather with tractors and Land Rovers to ferry ration kits for British paratroops. And Patrick Bishop of The Observer tells of a group of SAS men, mustachioed and long-haired, like extras from a Sam Peckinpah western. "Every time we get near an RG patrol, they leg it," one of the SAS men was quoted as saying. "We ran into one the other night," he went on. "Took 2, wounded 2, killed 3.
HMS Hydra has brought out some of the most serious casualties from the sea and ground battles. Out of the 51 wounded men, 16 are stretcher cases. Some of them sailors with serious burns suffered when their ships were hit during Argentine air raids. It's only 5 days steaming from here to the Falklands, and the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires, is just across the River Plate. But to the people of Uruguay, the British ship is from a war they want no part of. Although some people stood and watched as she slipped into port, hundreds of men out for a day's fishing didn't even notice her. The Uruguayan government has agreed that Montevideo should be Britain's main transit centre for the wounded. Each casualty is ferried from the port one by one in a convoy of ambulances. But some of the men may not be fit enough to fly home immediately, and beds have been made available for them at the city's British hospital. But all the walking wounded and most of the stretcher patients can be moved. A chaplain came off the ship today and talked to some of the doctors who examined the men. Hydra is the second hospital ship to arrive in 3 days. Clearly pleased to be in port, although only for a few hours, the crew took time off to do odd jobs and relax on deck before heading back south. Can you tell me how you're all feeling? With these transfers successfully completed, the British government are now talking to the Uruguayans about the possibility of releasing here more than 1,000 Argentine prisoners. Brent Sadler, ITN, Montevideo.
Marine commandos have outflanked the Argentines north of Stanley. Strong British positions have now been established on the mountains and are now only 5 miles from the Argentine garrison, and we can report now that British sea and land forces control and move freely along the northern waters of East Falklands, and large quantities of stores, guns, ammunition and men have been moved up there. Most of the military commanders here admit that one of our biggest problems remains the West Falklands, and over the past few days, Royal Navy frigates and destroyers have continued to shell Argentine garrisons at Fox Bay and Pebble Island. And there have been other operations that one officer described to me as nuisances of every kind. But it is no secret here that our military commanders are concerned that the Argentines should not be allowed to continue to sneak in more troops and supplies onto the island. They are concerned that the West Falklands should not become a bargaining chip against us if we are forced into a ceasefire situation. Hence the additional need, as our militaries here see it, to push onto Stanley as rapidly as possible. But perhaps one of the most welcome bits of news for our troops on the ground is that many more Rapier ground-to-air defense missiles, much respected by Argentine pilots, are now in positions protecting our forward artillery batteries and troops on the ground. The children of Darwin and Goose Green have been kept indoors. Their parents have been told by the local British military commander not to let the children out unless they are accompanied at all times by a British soldier. The reason for the escort is simply that the area is still full of unexploded ammunition, including hand grenades and rockets. Yesterday, in the pouring rain and bitter winds, the 250 Argentine soldiers who were killed in the fighting at Darwin and Goose Green were buried in a mass grave. There are other single graves dug at random across the battlefield. They were marked until yesterday merely by a helmet stuck on a stick. But yesterday's burial served for all those who died. A British Army Roman Catholic chaplain conducted the service. It is our solemn duty, he said, to bury the dead. An Argentine officer stood beside him, repeating his words in Spanish. And there was so much rain during the service that when the Roman Catholic chaplain and the Argentine officer threw earth into the grave, the bodies were already covered in water.
Another 1,000 prisoners of war, most of them the Argentine troops who fought and surrendered at Darwin Goose Green, tonight left the Falklands on their way home to the Argentine. They're aboard the North Sea ferry Norland, 4 men sharing the 2-berth cabins, normally occupied in peacetime by passengers going from Hull to Rotterdam. As they came aboard, they were stripped, searched, given a shower and a hot meal. And watching them eat it, almost certainly it was their first proper meal in months. Air Commodore Pedroso, overall military commander of Darwin Goose Green, is among them. He, unlike his men, is full of complaints. He complained, for example, when he was given coffee, that he preferred water. Then, when his 1,000 men were each given milk to drink, he said he preferred coffee, so he was given water. His second-in-command at Goose Green, Lieutenant Colonel Ettolo Piaggi, does not complain. He does not seem the type to. We asked him how the civilians in Port Stanley were being treated. We asked him whether the Argentine commander there, Menendez, would allow the evacuation of civilians, especially women and children, before a British attack. He answered, "We now consider all the civilians our enemies. That is now clear to me. I can say I do not know now whether they would be allowed to leave." And to the question, will the Argentine garrison fight or surrender at Port Stanley, he answered without hesitation, "We will fight." Michael Nicholson, News at 10, with the British landing forces on the Falklands.
Nothing could have been more relaxed that Tuesday afternoon. The 5th were settled in. More supply ships had arrived in the estuary next to us, bringing in more men and more weapons for them to use. Men even took time off to fish for a change of diet. But then came the attack. The Skyhawks came in to attack and were out again with our gunfire chasing them too late. So sudden, so unannounced, we knew nothing until we saw the black smoke billowing out of the landing ship, Sir Galahad, and then the first signs of a fire aboard St. Tristram nearby. The attack happened so fast, there wasn't even time to think of taking cover. And as the ships were hit, many men aboard hadn't even time to pull on their anti-burn masks to save themselves from the heat flash as the bombs exploded. The 2 landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were bombed within 200 yards of each other as they were unloading supplies of ammunition and of men. They were in a narrow estuary at Fitzroy, leading off from Bluff Cove. The men had come to join the rest of their brigade here at Fitzroy, only 7 miles from Stanley. Sir Galahad had anchored only a few hours before, and the men were waiting for landing craft to come and get them. 1 hour later, and most of the men would have been safely ashore in their trenches. Our air defense missile, which most Argentine pilots respect, had come off the ships in the morning, but were still being set up on the hillside overlooking the estuary. Had the Argentine planes come just that 1 hour later, Rapier would have been ready for them. The bombs hit Sir Galahad aft through the engine room and accommodation sections. I watched from the shore less than 400 yards away and felt the impact on the ground below me as the hold full of ammunition exploded. Many were brought ashore with dreadful burns. Bullets came from their ammunition boxes, exploding in the heat, whistling and whirring past us. I saw hundreds of men rush forward along the decks, across the hold, pulling on their life jackets, pulling on their survival suits. Some, the ship's crewmen, just off watch, pulling on their shirts and trousers. Men were trapped on the wrong side of the fire, and not knowing what else to do, they jumped overboard, the flames spreading around them. I saw men swim underwater away from the ship to avoid the burning oil. And as they surfaced, I watched other men who were safely away forward of the flames, risk their own lives, jumping into the water with life jackets to save those men swimming below them. Inflatable rubber life rafts, bright orange, were hurled over the side. Some immediately burst into flames as debris from the explosions hit them. Others landed, but were blown by the wind into the burning oil. Ropes were thrown down the side of the ship, and men clambered down them, and despite the wind, despite the heat of the metal on their feet, despite the movement of the ship swinging them backwards and forwards along the side of the hull, they got down into their life rafts. The strong wind, gusting now, fanned the fires, enormous fires, as the fuel tanks exploded. The ship was half enveloped in black, thick smoke now, but the Royal Navy Sea King and Wessex helicopter pilots and their crews ignored the fires, they ignored the explosions and the ammunition erupting around them, and flew their machines into the smoke to lift the queues of men waiting below them. The helicopters waited in turn, steady in the air, to move in once the one in front of them had moved away, to winch the men off. I watched one pilot steer his machine slowly and deliberately into the black air and hover, completely blinded, enveloped in the smoke. And then we saw his crewman winching down a line to pick a man out of the sea. 3 times that winchman went down, and 3 times he brought men up into the blackness that covered his helicopter. I saw another helicopter almost touch the water. Its rotor blades seemed to be spinning through the flames to pick up a man in a bright orange survival suit who was clinging to the anchor chain. Lifeboats were launched from Sir Tristram, the other ship, whose crew seemed to be containing their fire, and these boats, under power, began taking some of the rubber life craft in tow. Others began drifting, though, taken by the wind sometimes away from the inferno, but then suddenly towards it. Pilots in the helicopters saw this, and immediately 4 of them took their machines to the rear of the ship by the flames, came down low, and using the downdraft of their rotor blades, slowly began to push the rubber dinghies away. And slowly, yard by yard, each helicopter taking care of one dinghy full of men, they pushed them safely onto the beach. There was much heroism at Fitzroy, but this single tribute must be paid to the helicopter pilots and their winchmen who saved so many. The casualties and survivors, many suffering from shock, many who had heard their own friends screaming in the locked dormitories, unable to get out, were picked up from the beach by soldiers who had run from their trenches to help.
This one's got more. Okay, gentlemen, those who are not. Let's get ready to do this
Dozens of soldiers waded out into the freezing water up to their chests in it to pull men to safety.
Bring him in. She's coming, she's coming. Okay, lads, you've got people pulling you in. Pull it! Come on! Jerk the fucking thing! Jerk it straight! Pull it! Come on, pull! Hold it, hold it! Hold it there. Step fast, you won't fucking pull it. Give me some slack, we get out of the way. Okay, grab that, when they've unloaded it, bring it back out after us, okay? Next time I want to paddle, I'm going to Blackpool. Right on the track, lads, right on the track. Okay, well done. Woody! Over there, Woody. Right on that track there, lads. Okay, when they've got the can you send it back out for us? Well done, hey. In there. Right, Cloverfield, you're in charge of that right from now on, okay? Grab him off. Keep the door that line! Side on the line! Don't worry, you're on the camera.
To top the hill, mate.
Go anyway. Come here. Places.
I watched soldiers struggling in the water, picking the injured out of the life rafts and carrying them on their shoulders back to the shore, and then go back again for more. Others were helped and carried up the steep slope of the beach to the waiting armoured cars and the light tanks. Some were helped inside. Others were so badly injured, strapped tight to the stretcher, that they had to be lifted on top of the tanks and driven to the field hospital. From Fitzroy, after emergency treatment, they were flown by helicopter to the field hospital at San Carlos Water, and then onto the hospital ship Uganda. The Chinese crew, the cooks, the laundrymen, the stewards on these Royal Fleet auxiliary ships were badly burnt, the bomb exploding in their quarters. They are normally the most cautious of all aboard these ships, the first to put on their anti-flash units, their hoods and their gloves. But no, they said, we knew nothing, we heard nothing. There was no warning, just a blast. And then we saw men with skin dripping from their heads, from their faces. It was a day of tragedy, but I vouch it was a day of extraordinary heroism and selflessness by every man who witnessed it. Michael Nicholson, News at 10 at Fitzroy on the Falkland Islands.
First to arrive at Downing Street this morning were the Foreign Secretary, Francis Pym, and the Defence Secretary, John Nott. The Falklands, as ever, the major preoccupation for both of them. Then came the President himself. His biggest worry today was clearly Lebanon, the first on the list of subjects for talks at number 10. Breakfast had to wait until the cameramen had had their fill of pictures. The two leaders and their foreign ministers were to eat away from their officials in a small dining room before joining up for talks in the cabinet room. When Prime Minister and President emerged, despite talk of differences on the long-term future of the Falklands, Mrs. Thatcher made a point of saying thank you again for American support.
I would like once again to record our thanks to our American friends, to the President and to Mr. Secretary Haig for the staunch support they've given us and continue to give us over the Falkland Islands, and their realization that we must make it seen to the world over that aggression cannot pay.
The President, well protected as always, thanked his hostess warmly.
We leave strengthened with the knowledge that the great friendship, the great alliance that has existed for so long between our two peoples, the United Kingdom and the United States, remains and is, if anything, stronger than it has ever been.
Mr. President. Afterwards, Mr. Reagan was steered away from answering questions. Long-term plans for the Falklands weren't discussed in great detail. But when decisions do have to be made, it's not clear that today's complete harmony between the two countries will be preserved. But today, the President could fly off with his close relationship with Mrs. Thatcher apparently unimpaired.
For us, the battle for Port Stanley and the retaking of the Falklands began on Friday the 11th of June at Fitzroy, a very English-sounding name in very Scottish-looking countryside. Fitzroy was the headquarters of the 5th Infantry Brigade, the second arm of the British pincer movement that finally took the Argentine garrison. Men were busy digging in, but it was hoped they wouldn't have more than an overnight stay. There was an urgency now to be on the move before the Antarctic winter got any worse.
Have you seen them yet?
The guns of the Royal Artillery were dug in and camouflaged 3 miles up from Fitzroy at Bluff Cove, and the last of their ammunition was being flown in. The helicopters, the Sea Kings and Wessex, are the workhorses of this fighting force. The war could not have been fought without them. The gun crews had already set their sights on Argentine troop positions 6 miles away on Mounts Tumbledown, Mounts William, Two Sisters and Mount Sapper, names we were to become very familiar with. At their headquarters, the officers of the 5th Brigade had assembled that Friday afternoon for their briefing, their final O group, before they in turn went out to brief their men. Brigadier Tony Wilson began.
First of all, I want to make absolutely certain that you're right up to date on our own deployment. There have been some minor changes, and we have moved some people around. And therefore, to get a common start point, you must know exactly where everyone is and what their orders are for the next 24 or 48 hours. Having then, as it were, set the scene, we'll look then at Commander Land Forces Falkland Islands intentions, as far ahead as we can see them, and what his directive to the 2 brigades has been. I'll then tell you what 3 Commando Brigade are going to be doing, and how they intend to set about it, and then I'll turn your attention to this brigade, and tell you what 5 Brigade is going to do, and exactly how we're going to set about that. No doubt at all, we've got off to an extraordinarily good start here, despite some of the incidents that have happened since we arrived in this part of the world. We are in a very good position indeed. I intend to capitalize on it.
Saturday the 12th, the men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion didn't have to wait long at Fitzroy, and they were delighted.
Oh, beautiful. Followed by jam and biscuits. And that way and smile. Turn that way, that's it.
They were being lifted 5 miles on and up to Wireless Ridge, overlooking the Argentines on Mounts Tumbledown and William. But they were to be held in reserve. They'd done their bit at Darwin and Goose Green, and they were to be held back. At least that was the theory of the General Staff. But this was the Paras War, and we knew they were bent on getting to Stanley first. We knew because they told us so.
Fighting through. Just keep on going, there's no stop, no turning back, it's just straight through. No one been taught to turn back, everything is just straight through. Just keep on fighting.
It's, in the eyes of most of the blokes here, it's something that has to be done, and it's principle the fact that land was ours to start with, and then they now try to take it from us, and nobody will stand for that, really.
So you haven't changed your mind at all?
No.
How about you?
No, I'm certainly not. Certainly not, no. I agree with everything he says.
I mean, when we left Blighty over 2 months ago, there was waving flags and everything else, lots of enthusiasm. And, you know, we felt the same way. Are you still feeling as strong about it, even though you've suffered?
Well, we've got to do, haven't we? You know, we can't just jack halfway. We've got to carry on.
No doubts at all?
No, not at all.
And how about you?
Well, it's like he says, I mean, if you've got to do something, you've got to carry it out all the way through. No use jacking halfway through. We've got to take Stanley. It's no stopping us now, I don't reckon.
Well, it started off as British soil, Argy's barged in, and we're here to kick them out.
And you're the people to do it?
Well, us and the rest of them.
Throughout that day, the airlift of men and supplies out of Fitzroy to our front line, the line of final confrontation, continued. There were to be no long route marches, no slow, cumbersome convoys of guns and vehicles. This was the war of the leapfrog, jumping from one attack to the next by courtesy of the Royal Navy's helicopters.
Many of the prisoners that came down from Mount Harriet were still armed, although in no state to use their weapons, and worried about what the British would do to them after they'd given up. Among them were a couple of officers, including a lieutenant colonel, who seemed to be carrying more cigarettes than vital information. And there was this young Argentine soldier being brought in on a stretcher, suffering from the effects of the artillery bombardment. In general, the Argentines seemed again to be relieved that for them the fighting was over and they could stop living what must have been a nightmare existence of trying to survive the shell fire, knowing that, as indeed happened, it would be followed by an infantry assault. The Royal Marines, perhaps equally naturally, were in high spirits as they saw the prisoners coming in. But all the while, the guns of 29 Battery were being trained and fired on the new objectives ever closer to Stanley.
Sunday the 13th, first light and the first casualties of the first night offensive were flown into the field hospital at Fitzroy. The wounds were almost entirely from artillery shrapnel. The Argentines were hiding behind a constant barrage from their guns set up inside Stanley itself. Guns that, according to reports, were firing from civilian areas and which, if British guns had fired back, would have certainly guaranteed civilian casualties. So, for a while, British guns did not fire back, and our front line suffered. It was something the British soldiers would not forgive the Argentines for. Argentine casualties came too, medevaced in by British helicopter pilots who were risking their own lives under fire. An enemy who now shared the same hospital, an enemy given the same chance to live.
The first few hours of the battle for Stanley, and already we're getting little bits of information back from the people who are returning from the battlefield. We hear that the 3rd Marine Commandos and the 3rd Paras have taken their objectives after a 7-hour battle. They've taken Mount Longdon and they've taken Two Sisters. They have also taken many casualties. We hear that something like 90 prisoners, Argentine prisoners, are on their way back, being marched back through the snow across the mountains. Among them, we're told, is an artillery major carrying a map showing the positions of some of their major artillery batteries. We've also heard, though we can't be sure yet because this is just hearsay coming back from the lines, that HMS Glamorgan, a destroyer, has been hit by a land-based missile while she was, this is during the night, while she was on bombardment, naval bombardment of Argentine positions on shore. But we hear that she's managing to steam safely out of the area back to the fleet.
Those prisoners began to arrive at Fitzroy. In that first hour, over 150 were flown in to be put into the sheep pens under guard. And they told the same story. The battle for Stanley was being fought on the mountains surrounding it. And we now had 3 of them, Mounts Two Sisters, Harriet and Longdon. British armour began moving to them along the track that is the high road to Stanley, the Scorpions and Scimitars of the Blues and Royals. Six miles to town now, and 3 more mountains to go. We could just see Stanley in the distance, mostly hidden by tumble-down and sapper, and we could see smoke coming from buildings along the waterfront. And we heard that the British commanders, unwilling to sustain further casualties from the Argentine guns hidden between the houses, had ordered them to be destroyed.
Just seen a bomb drop.
We were with the Gurkha Rifles, the men whose legend as hard fighters travels with them wherever they go. Their second in command was Major Bill Dawson, and on the top of Two Sisters, he briefed us.
We are trying to take advantage of that, the fact that the enemy have broken, and we're trying to double up in double quick time and take out Mount William and bring out some more troops around the side to cut off as many of the enemy as we can before going up into Stanley itself. The details of that are being worked out now. There's a certain amount of confusion as to who does what and how the resources are going to be made available to make certain that this operation can go on. But that is at the moment all I can tell you. That's all I know.
This was not the front line. The front line was just ahead and below us. The attacks had all been planned to take place at night. There was too much open ground between the mountains, land without cover for British troops to risk daylight offensives. The night attacks were to be the key factor to our success. We stayed with the Gurkha Signals Company on Two Sisters as Argentine shells came in around us. We are on Two Sisters. We were helicoptered in with the Gurkhas this morning. Our job is to wait here with the tactical part of the 1st and the 7th Gurkhas and wait for the Scots to move ahead of us. They are now in the valley, moving up the side of the hill towards Tumbledown, and our job is to wait here and move in after them. Unfortunately, people have been seen on this skyline by the Argentine artillery spotters in Stanley. That's the reason they're shelling here, thinking that we are the main force. And behind us, shelling over our heads, are the British 105s. And all the time, helicopters coming in, dropping in troops. See, come on. That's another one of their guns. All the time, helicopters, Royal Naval and Royal Air Force helicopters are coming in, dropping troops off, even while this artillery is going on.
9 killed in attack on HMS Glamorgan, and the death toll at Bluff Cove was 50. Defence Secretary says the outcome is not in doubt. We have an eyewitness account of the big push towards Port Stanley. Good evening. The Defence Secretary, Mr. Knott, has said 9 British sailors were killed and 17 injured in an Argentine attack on the destroyer HMS Glamorgan. He also announced that 50 men died when Argentine planes bombed the landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram last Tuesday. All relatives have been informed. Mr. Knott said the casualty figures had been kept secret to confuse the Argentines about the strength of the task force. In a separate statement, the Ministry of Defence admitted some Falkland Islanders may have been killed and injured in the latest fighting. Mr. Knott began by giving details of yesterday's attack on Argentine positions west of Port Stanley.
We now firmly hold Mount Longdon, Two Sisters and Mount Harriet, all of which dominate the ground to the west of Stanley. Some 400 prisoners were captured, together with considerable quantities of equipment, including mortars and anti-tank weapons. It was important for the success of the land operation that the Argentinians were not able to assess exactly when, how, or in what strength we would attack. It is clear that the Argentinians greatly overestimated the extent of the casualties and damage resulting from their air attack on Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad on Tuesday. We wished them to remain uncertain about our strength on the ground and our capability to mount an early attack. None of this, of course, delayed the notification of next of kin, all of whom have been informed. Surprise was achieved in our operations, and the progress made by British forces in their advance towards Port Stanley means that I can now give the official details of casualties from last Tuesday's attack. The landing ships were carrying large numbers of troops from the Welsh Guards and supporting units. 43 men died in the attack or are missing, presumed dead. 46 men were wounded, and a number sustained minor injuries. There were also casualties among the crews of the landing ships. On Sir Galahad, 3 officers and 2 members of the crew were killed, and 2 officers and 9 crew were injured. On the landing ship Sir Tristram, 2 members of the crew were killed. All the remainder of the crew are safe. The wounded are receiving treatment on board British hospital ships. The land operations were supported by Harrier attacks and naval gunfire from ships of the task force. There was also a successful Vulcan attack on Port Stanley Airport. These attacks made a major contribution to the success of our troops. However, in the course of the bombardment, the destroyer HMS Glamorgan was hit by enemy fire, and 9 members of the ship's company were killed and 17 injured. Next of kin have been informed. HMS Glamorgan sustained some damage, but she remains operational and is continuing her activities in the task force. In further operations today, an Argentine patrol craft was detected, attacked, and disabled by Sea Harriers from HMS Invincible. Our successes on the ground over the weekend mark another significant step to securing the complete and final withdrawal of Argentine forces from the Falkland Islands. There is some way still to go, but the outcome is not in doubt.
Military sources in Buenos Aires say there's been more heavy fighting today in the Port Stanley area. The military high command say Argentine jets attacked the new British positions captured yesterday, concentrating on Two Sisters Hill. The high command has conceded its troops were driven back 2 miles by the attack. This report on the fighting from Jeremy Hands, which arrived yesterday, has just been cleared by the Ministry of Defence.
It was a classic commando assault. At midnight, the so-called starting line was crossed simultaneously in 3 places as the British troops attacked the 3 key positions held by the enemy around Port Stanley. All night I monitored the battle with senior officers in a forward commando headquarters. The reports coming in from the units were crisp, clear, and very encouraging. Each British attack was opposed by well-dug-in and well-supplied Argentine troops. We could see and hear the continual barrage of shells, some aimed with deadly accuracy at the enemy strongholds, some thankfully less accurate coming towards us. The infantry battle raged throughout the night. In some cases, the British advances were held up by mortar fire, in others by machine guns and snipers, but the forward momentum was never lost. One Argentine heavy machine gun on the Two Sisters was captured with ammunition, and along with much more of their equipment, will now be used against them. A battalion drew special praise from the commanders for their efforts in capturing the heavily defended Mount Longdon. But afterwards, General Jeremy Moore was delighted with everyone's performance. We now have our lead positions exactly where the Argentine lead positions were until last night, he said, adding, there was some extremely good fighting by our young men with excellent support from the Royal Naval Bombardment and our artillery ashore. Before daylight, each of the 3 objectives was secured. British casualties had been remarkably light, but as yet it's been impossible to assess the Argentine losses, although initial reports are that they were heavy. There was no doubt, however, about the number of prisoners taken. By mid-afternoon, 340 Argentines had turned up, some of them considered to be most important. Others had surrendered from positions that weren't even being attacked. I saw some prisoners being brought in, blindfolded, arms tied behind their backs and dejected. And as I moved forward in the fresh, frosty sun of a midwinter morning, the extent of the British success and its importance became even clearer. Our troops, already in control of the important high ground around Port Stanley, now have secured positions from where they can control virtually all comings and goings from the island's capital. The 3 objectives were hard to take indeed, but the rewards are great. Stanley can no longer be regarded as a stronghold for the Argentines, merely a last refuge, which now lies at the mercy of the British guns and encircled by British troops. And as the grip on Stanley tightens, the more Argentine prisoners are seen woefully trudging back to the prisoner of war ships, the mood gets ever more buoyant. They've now not only seen action, but tasted victory in battle too. And while they know firsthand that the Argentine foe is not the pushover he'd been made out to be in some quarters, the British go into the next phase of the operation knowing that he can be beaten. The large white vapor trail, V for victory sign in the sky, provided by 2 Harriers before last night's battle, was an extra encouragement that looks like being quite unnecessary. Jeremy Hands, British Television News, with the Royal Marines near Port Stanley.
The Ministry of Defence have admitted Falkland Islanders may have been killed and injured in the latest fighting outside Port Stanley. They say there is evidence to support Argentine claims that 2 women were killed and 4 other islanders injured, 2 of them seriously. The Argentines have named the dead women as Mrs. Susan Whitley and Mrs. Doreen Bonner. Both lived on the west side of Port Stanley, beyond Government House. The Argentines claim they were killed by British naval bombardment. John Doyle asked a Falklands councillor, Mr. John Cheek, whether he believed the Argentine claim.
We're treating it as probably being true until it's definitely confirmed, but yes, we believe it is probably true.
Now, you've heard of this source from other than from the government sources, haven't you?
Other than the Argentine sources, yes. We got from an amateur radio operator in the Falklands, more or less confirmed the details.
Have you been able to discover exactly what happened?
The Argentinians are saying that it was British naval gunfire. I have my doubts because the houses are, although in the same area, we're talking about 50, 60, 70 yards difference. We know there was an Argentine ammunition dump in that area, very close to these houses. My own guess is it went off. How it went off, we don't know.
Now, you know these islanders very well.
One knows practically everyone in Stanley reasonably well. Of those that killed, both of them married, one reasonably young. Husband, in fact, was the veterinary officer, and the other one, the husband worked for the Public Works Department as a surveyor.
The latest British casualties from the Falklands have arrived in Montevideo on their way home to Britain. A hospital ship brought in 60 men, many badly injured. Earlier in Montevideo, 1,000 Argentine prisoners captured at Goose Green were handed over.
At daybreak, another British hospital vessel entered harbour. HMS Herald brought 60 British casualties. They were from the battles in San Carlos Water and Port Darwin. With each wave of men to disembark from the Red Cross-protected ships that have come here, it's evident that the wounded want to put on as brave a face they can in the circumstances. But never before has it been seen with such determination. Some who were in obvious pain hobbled onto the quayside, but still managed to wave and smile to the crew. Others were carried off as best they could and handed to Uruguayan medical teams who ferried them to the airport for the flight home. And with mounting casualties from the fighting, 2 more hospital ships will arrive here next week. 1,000 prisoners came in at dusk aboard the North Sea ferry Norland. They were offloaded during the night at the insistence of the Argentines, no doubt anxious that the world should not see the face of defeat in her men as they filed off the ship in pairs. British officials said the dejected troops were mostly teenagers, the majority barely 16 years old. Brent Sadler, ITN, Montevideo.
Good evening. British forces have broken through to within 2.5 miles of Port Stanley. Attacking on 3 fronts, they've secured vital positions in the foothills overlooking the Falklands capital: Tumbledown Mountain, Wireless Ridge and Mount William. Argentine forces are now said to be in full retreat after fierce fighting overnight. The Defence Secretary, Mr. John Nott, gave the news a short time ago.
We have just received the following information from the Commander British Land Forces, Falkland Islands. Last night, British forces pressed forward from their positions on high ground surrounding Port Stanley. By this morning, our forces had secured the key positions of Tumbledown Mountain and Mount William to the southwest and Wireless Ridge to the northwest of Port Stanley. From their new positions, our forces can see large numbers of Argentine soldiers retreating and streaming back into Port Stanley. Our forces are moving forward
to exploit their success.
Radio messages from Port Stanley to the Argentine mainland have revealed that conditions behind the Argentine lines are deteriorating and that Argentine troops are suffering greatly. But the radio broadcasts have now broken down after what seems to be a total loss of power.
ITN has been monitoring the two open shortwave radio links from Port Stanley to the Argentine mainland. Over the weekend, as usual, sons, husbands and fathers serving with the Argentine forces in Stanley, talking to their families in Buenos Aires. A sad insight into the human tragedy of the war and the revelation that the troops suffered greatly on Friday night in particular. Yesterday, the open lines completely broke down. Before they did so, an Argentine commander spoke openly of their desperate need for an item codenamed 1701 and warned that conditions were now so bad that it could not now be delivered. His last words were, "My power is failing." Since then, the line has been dead. Today, only the teletyped, coded transmissions are getting through from the Argentine army, 5-letter combinations which are unscrambled by computer and which can be transmitted on battery-run portable radios. With an apparent total loss of mains and generated power, verbal contact between Argentina and the Falklands appears to have been out for more than 24 hours. John Snow, ITN, Punta Arenas.
At Mount Harriet, British troops have found thousands of rounds of deadly dum-dum bullets in captured Argentine ammunition boxes. The hollow-nosed bullets, which spread on impact, are banned under the Geneva Convention. A safe zone has been set up by the Red Cross in Port Stanley, where civilians can shelter during the final battle for the town. As many as 600 people are still thought to be trapped there between the Argentine forces and advancing British troops. The quarter-mile square zone around the town's stone cathedral would provide the shelter.
The Red Cross neutralized zone lies on the waterfront at Port Stanley, in the middle. The main Argentine gun emplacements are to either side of the built-up area. It's about 100 meters by 120 and makes up about 1/20th of the whole town area. As Red Cross officials said today, it'll be adequate but cramped. The block will be marked out by Red Cross flags and more will be painted on rooftops. There are about 20 houses in all, and all of them, except 2 or 3, are wooden. But the area does include, and we assume this is why it's been chosen, the island's largest stone building, the cathedral.
One of the British successes in the battle for the Falklands has been the Harrier jump jet. They've shot down large numbers of Argentine planes. Ray Maloney asked a Harrier pilot, who's just back from the Falklands, whether the dogfights compared with those in the Second World War.
The majority, no. The majority have been close engagements of the Harrier being directed onto an escaping, or indeed an attack coming into the AOA, with no hard-turning fight, just a quick acquisition with the missiles, let the missiles go, they destroy the aircraft, and then we clear.
A lot of people back here are amazed, even frightened by the lethal nature of the weapons that are being used in war, particularly in the war in the Falklands. What do you feel about them?
Well, I think that there are a number of missiles that are coming out head and shoulders above the overall level of fighting. The Sidewinder missile we're using, the Seawolf missile that the Navy's employing on the Type 22, and indeed the Sea Dart battery, and also from the Argentinians' side, the Exocet missile are proving very, very lethal indeed.
Now the fighting in the Falklands again. We've just received an eyewitness report of Saturday's British offensive to capture the mountains from which today's attacks were launched. Independent radio news reporter Kim Sabida went forward with a company which led the offensive.
As we progressed painfully up the hill, long-range artillery from around Stanley became more accurate. It's no exaggeration or boast that in the 3 hours we spent on that slope, every one of us came within feet of incineration from high explosive shells. The diabolic scream of the missile through the air, followed by the heat of the explosion, and then, a few seconds later, the Catherine wheel-like buzz of twisted red-hot metal fragments sounding a second alarm, all sounds and images we shall never forget. One lump fell by my feet. I picked it up. Red hot, I dropped it again quickly. When it was cool, I picked it up and examined its jagged edges. Some of the men around me weren't so lucky. They bear the injuries such devices are meant to inflict. But amongst our 3-company attack, more than 300 men in all, only one man died, a corporal. How the others escaped, I don't know. I have to put it down to the skill, determination and courage of the men themselves. Edging nearer, the lead units fired off their anti-tank weapons, Milan 66 and 84mm rockets, streaks of white light flashing upwards to explode among the rocks and stones. But as one gun was silenced and we moved out from behind our cover, others would open up. The progress was, as I've said, painfully slow, but it was over as quickly as it had begun. Gaining the high ground to their flank, the troops were in a position to infiltrate the enemy positions in strength. Before long, prisoners were taken and the firing died down. The experience of the previous 3 hours had been so intense it had left some of us drained and inarticulate. As one officer told me later, "What do you say when someone asks you weeks afterwards how you felt? You can't answer them. For a long time afterwards, your feelings just don't seem to exist."
Monday the 14th, after a night of constant artillery exchanges, with the fires in Stanley still burning and in 12 degrees of frost, British troops patrolled back to us. The Scots Guards, they said, had taken Tumbledown and the Gurkhas were advancing on Mount William. Royal Marine Lieutenant David Stewart told us of his part in the fighting.
And then last night, we came up as a company, take this position here. They'd removed themselves from where we initially had the contact.
Was that machine gun?
That was a machine gun, yes. They weren't there. The first troop took that, and as we came up about 200 meters, we came under fire from up here and also further down as well. And then we simply came up as a company. Two troop came up here and took the SF positions, the machine gun positions, which were up here. We reckon there was about a company, but as we came up to them, they ran out, they bugged out.
What kind of weapons did they have? Was it just machine guns?
GPMGs, the same machine guns that we use.
Yeah.
And FNs.
You were under fire on the way up, were you?
Oh yes. Yes. Yeah.
What kind of fight did they put up?
Initially, heavy fire. And then it appeared that as we put down our fire, and we were using the 66 anti-tank weapon, they began to move back from there. It appeared that they left sort of die-hard chaps up here, and as we got closer to them, they also ran away. So in fact, we found no one up here at all. By the time we got here, they'd all gone.
Then, just after 2 o'clock that Monday afternoon, the shelling stopped. We could hear only the occasional small arms fire, and that less and less frequently.
Hello.
The mountains and the valleys between them became silent. And then we thought of a possibility, a rather marvelous possibility. Was there a ceasefire? Could it be a surrender? At 5 minutes to 4, Major Bill Dawson came out of his tent.
From there, Mike. Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
8-2, Roger, out.
Can you tell us what he said, Major?
What he has said is that negotiations will start tonight. Although there appears to be a ceasefire at the moment and the Argentinian forces in the Falklands have appeared to have surrendered, this does not necessarily mean that the forces in the mainland Argentine will necessarily stop fighting. Therefore, we will have normal CAP, that is air cover, combat air patrols, and we should take the normal precautions against being caught by surprise or whatever. Okay?
Yeah, is there a white flag flying?
There is a white flag flying over Stanley. Very marvellous.
Well, that's how we heard the news at 5 to 4 on Monday, June the 14th, from an officer of the Gurkha Rifles after what he'd heard over his radio from his own men overlooking Stanley. They're telling him that a white flag is flying over that town. Is this, then, the end to the war?
Taro Tahajas Pansa, Hawkeye. Kura Testesa, Yaunsa, Dui Jana, Group Ma, Lerano Patsa, Pat Jamagana Pore, and Isabale, Wanko Objective Majansa Bore Ratiko Lagi. Six us up? Pura pack up Bandavas Milano Pore.
Bloody marvellous, he said,
And that summed it up for us perfectly. The Paras had made it. They were the first into Stanley, just as they said they would, just as everybody, possibly even the General Staff, knew they would. They'd come off Wireless Ridge, quickly across the open valley, and up to the racecourse at the edge of town before anyone could stop them. As long as people talk of the Falklands campaign, they'll talk of the Second Paras.
From the Two Sisters, the Royal Marines threaded their way carefully down the pass, but the route was blocked by minefields, and every few minutes the column dragged to a halt as the way was carefully cleared. A technical officer came back with some of the anti-personnel and anti-tank mines that had been laid to trap us.
In fact, what you do is unscrew the tops of the plates on the anti-personnel mines, and they are then armed. But as of yet, they haven't been armed. The anti-tank ones, however, have been. The safety plate has been removed, and that is ready to detonate.
And then the almost unbelievable news that there wasn't going to be any Argentine opposition in Stanley. There was, after all, apparently not going to be a last fight. A Union Jack was hastily brought out of a man's pack and attached to his radio aerial. And then there it was, Port Stanley, closer than any of us had ever seen it before. Amid the devastation were a few straggling Argentines who'd not been able to get back to the eastern side of the town before the British had arrived. And there were some very happy paratroopers, delighted and excited that it seemed at last to be all over.
Who was the first to put up the flag?
Two para!
I put it up again. Two para the first in again?
That's right,
yes,
again. Two para was first in.
How much did you beat the others?
2.5 hours.
At the airport itself, the scenes of devastation were greater than anywhere else I'd seen. It was the aftermath of a long campaign, one that had cost many lives, and one that so many people in uniform, and indeed in plain clothes, have told me was so unnecessary. But now it was all over, and the pieces of shattered lives and broken properties could start to be put back together again.
Mrs. Thatcher says there are white flags all over Port Stanley. Good evening. The Prime Minister has just said in the House of Commons that the Argentines are flying white flags over Port Stanley. She said British troops had entered the town and large numbers of Argentine troops had thrown down their weapons. Negotiations for a surrender are now going on, she said. Earlier, the Argentine Military High Command had said a ceasefire had been agreed on the Falklands to last until 2 p.m. our time tomorrow. There'd been no confirmation before that from the Ministry of Defence in London. Whitehall sources were saying that 7,000 Argentine troops in Port Stanley were on the run, fleeing through the deserted streets. Meanwhile, the Pentagon in the United States was saying that the Argentines were in the process of surrendering. Mrs. Thatcher had left Downing Street for the Commons a short time ago, and she's making her statement in the House now. The ceasefire was reportedly arranged at a face-to-face meeting between General Mario Menendez, the Argentine commander on the Falklands, and Major General Jeremy Moore, commander of the British Land Forces. General Menendez was then reported to have flown to Buenos Aires to report to the military junta there. Although it hasn't confirmed the ceasefire, the Ministry of Defence said task force commanders had the authority to accept a surrender.
The first sign of an impending Argentine collapse came with a brief statement from the Defence Secretary, Mr. Nott, this afternoon. He said a second major British assault overnight had pushed the Argentine soldiers from their last full defensive line, and that they were running back to Stanley. Last night, the British commanded the Two Sisters Ridge, some 7 miles west of Stanley. The Argentines were still on Tumbledown Mount and Wireless Ridge. But then last night came the final big push. Thousands of Royal Marines, paras and guardsmen battled fiercely with the Argentines and captured their hilltop positions. But the British commander saw hundreds of Argentines running back to Stanley, and he decided to follow through his attack.
The Argentine soldiers were chased all the way to the town, and fierce fighting was reported on the outskirts, well away from the safe area for civilians allocated by the Red Cross earlier in the day. During the first British push towards Stanley last Friday, over 50 Argentine soldiers were killed, but there were British losses too. Over 20 British soldiers were believed killed in that action. British deaths in the Falklands crisis amount to more than 220, therefore, and the Argentines are thought to have lost over 750 men. In spite of clear skies today and yesterday, the Argentine Air Force has not been able to mount major raids against British troops, though in a brief attack yesterday, another Mirage was shot down. The ceasefire is due to run until 2 p.m. London time tomorrow. The Argentine commander will presumably be using that time to try to negotiate the most honourable surrender that he can. But Britain will be insisting on nothing less than the total withdrawal of all Argentine troops from the islands. And that will have to include the 1,000 or so Argentine soldiers still left on West Falkland at Fox Bay and Pebble Island. The ceasefire is only for a limited duration, and it is conceivable that fighting could start again, but considering the commanding position the British task force is now in, it does seem unthinkable.
Argentina's military junta issued a series of statements through the day to prepare people for bad news. Norman Rees in Buenos Aires reports on the build-up to tonight's announcement in Argentina.
Argentine defence forces had taken a battering all day during a heavy British offensive launched on 3 fronts at 10:30 last night. The military junta, after first saying that their troops were putting up fierce resistance, issued a communique this morning confirming that 2 key Argentine positions at Mount Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge had fallen under the British onslaught. British troops were now less than 4 kilometres from Port Stanley. Military sources here say that it was after this that the commander of the British troops on the islands, Major General Jeremy Moore, flashed a message to his Argentine counterpart suggesting a meeting. The Argentine commander and military governor of the Falklands, Brigadier General Mario Menendez, who had earlier predicted a crushing defeat for Britain, delayed his reply while he consulted with the military junta in Buenos Aires. Eventually, he was given permission to go ahead as long as the honor of Argentine soldiers wasn't compromised. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in what could be an attempt to prepare people here for the worst, issued another communique saying that British forces continued to gain ground and that Argentine soldiers were faced with superior numbers, equipment, and technology. No details of the battlefield meeting between Major General Moore and General Menendez have emerged, except that it took place at 4 o'clock local time, that's 8 o'clock this evening in London, and that during the talks an informal ceasefire was observed. Military sources here say that General Menendez may now be on his way to Buenos Aires to convey the results of the meeting to the military junta, and that the ceasefire will continue until 2 o'clock London time tomorrow to give him chance to return to the front. It's believed here that nothing has been formally signed between the two sides, but Argentine military sources are saying 2 things. First, that a British victory in the battle for Port Stanley is now inevitable, and secondly, that to continue to offer resistance will lead to further very heavy loss of life. Given the makeup of the military junta, nothing can be certain here tonight, but it is beginning to look as if Argentina may well be considering surrender. Norman Rees, News at 10 in Buenos Aires.
Intercepted radio transmissions from Port Stanley to the Argentine mainland had indicated that conditions behind the Argentine lines were bad. But as John Snow reported from Chile, the broadcasts now appear to have been cut off altogether.
Throughout the crisis, 2 open radio shortwave links have existed between Port Stanley and the Argentine mainland. For the most part, Argentine troops have used them to speak to their relatives at home. Yesterday, sons and husbands were talking in depressed tones to their loved ones in Buenos Aires, an unhappy insight into the human tragedy of the war. On Friday night, in particular, they said they had suffered terribly. One man told his father he'd be home in 2 weeks. Then, for the first time on Sunday, we heard the normal domestic radio traffic interrupted by military commanders openly asking for further assistance. One officer speaking of the desperate need for an item codenamed 1701, warning that conditions were now so bad that it would now probably never be delivered. His last words were, "I must go now, the power is failing." From that time, more than 24 hours ago, the line has been dead and there has been no verbal contact. This morning, only teletyped coded transmissions were reaching the mainland from Argentine troops in Port Stanley. Bunches of 5-letter combinations which have to be unscrambled by a computer and which can be transmitted by battery-run portable radios. 4 hours ago, even these messages ceased. We have scoured every frequency we have ever monitored the Argentines using, and every one is silent. John Snow, News at 10, Punta Arenas, southern Chile.
Now let's go over live to Glyn Mathias in Westminster for the latest details on Mrs Thatcher's speech to the Commons.
Well, Mrs Thatcher was greeted with loud cheers by the MPs in the Commons tonight as she brought them what she called the latest information from the Battle of the Falklands. After successes last night on the battlefield, she said General Moore had decided to press forward, and Mrs Thatcher spoke of large numbers of Argentine soldiers throwing down their weapons and white flags flying over Port Stanley. British troops, she said, had been told not to fire except in self-defence, and talks were now in progress with General Menendez, the Argentine commander in Port Stanley, over the surrender of Argentine troops in both East and West Falklands. Well, this statement was greeted with loud cheers by the Commons, who were relieved that the conflict had ended at last, and relieved it had ended so suddenly and in such a dramatic way. The Labour leader, Mr Michael Foot, joined in the congratulations. He said the news would bring widespread and genuine rejoicing that there would now be an end to the bloodshed. Mr Foot admitted he'd had his differences and arguments with Mrs Thatcher over the Falklands conflict, but he said he well understood the anxieties and pressures on Mrs Thatcher over the past few weeks, and he congratulated the Prime Minister that those anxieties and pressures had now been relieved. Well, the Liberal leader, Mr Steele, and Dr David Owen for the Social Democrats also joined in the congratulations to the government on the outcome of this conflict, and MPs go home tonight much happier and more relieved than they've been for many weeks past. Glyn Mathias, News at 10, Westminster.
It was only earlier tonight that the Ministry of Defence named 57 British servicemen killed or missing in fighting in the Falklands recently. The list includes the 50 men who were killed when the Argentines attacked the British landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram a week ago. This latest picture from the Falklands shows survivors of both ships coming ashore. Most of the men killed on the Sir Galahad were Welsh guards. Those who survived and journalists at the scene paid tribute to rescues carried out by helicopter crews. The helicopters hovered low over the water in dense smoke to blow fumes away from men trying to escape in life rafts. And that main story once again. Mrs Thatcher has told the Commons tonight that the Argentines are flying white flags over Port Stanley. Negotiations for a full surrender are underway. The Prime Minister said British troops had been ordered not to fire except in self-defence. The Argentines had earlier said a ceasefire had been agreed until 2 p.m. our time tomorrow. Ray Maloney is at the Ministry of Defence now.
Here at the Defence Ministry tonight, the word from very senior officers is, and I quote, "We are sure it's all over," unquote. British troops, it said, are in total control of Port Stanley from their positions on the outskirts. Indeed, some troops may be already inside the town, to such a degree of control that the Argentines, it said, have finally been convinced that there is absolutely no sense in continuing to fight. Officials here say that negotiations will go on throughout the night, with both Buenos Aires and London involved, and that at dawn tomorrow the final arrangements for the Argentines to lay down their weapons will be completed. General Menendez, the Argentine commander, contrary to other reports, is said to be still on the islands. The British command made contact with him by radio to arrange the meeting. We don't know exactly where or exactly when at which this ceasefire was settled. The only one point of doubt here is whether, as Mrs Thatcher demanded tonight, any ceasefire agreed tomorrow will involve both West and East Falkland. Ray Maloney, News at 10 at the Ministry of Defence.
That's the momentous news tonight. Good night.
Tuesday, 15th of June. It was difficult to accept in those first daylight hours, looking at the state of Port Stanley, that the Argentines had been here for less than 3 months and that the British landing was less than a month ago. Stanley looked and felt as if it had been at war so much longer. And it was obvious from what they'd brought with them that the Argentines thought they'd come to stay. even to the point of renaming streets and buildings in Spanish for the convenience of their troops. Thankfully, the Royal Marines quickly began to put things right. Men who had been here when the Argentines invaded on April the 2nd and had defended Government House returned there that first morning of peace and raised the flag over the building they'd tried so hard to defend. It is easy to criticize an enemy in defeat, easy to believe the half-truths that were rapidly beginning to circulate around Stanley. But it is true to say that the Argentines have not left the capital as they found it. Their filth and vandalism is everywhere. It looked as if they'd been under siege for 12 months instead of 2. Proper hygiene must have been difficult in a garrison of 7 or more thousand men, but it wasn't helped by turning the floor of the post office into a public lavatory, with 3 months' excreta to be hosed away by Stanley's fire brigade. And the narrow streets were used as much as rubbish dumps as thoroughfares, with rotting food and unwanted discarded equipment littering the gutters. The Argentines had an odd way of impressing the Falklanders to the Argentine way of life. The Argentine cause is not helped by our confirmation that they placed one of their most lethal weapons, the 155mm long-range guns, deliberately in between people's houses, knowing how loath the British would be to fire back on them. The Argentine cause can't have been helped by placing their anti-aircraft guns in the school playground. It cannot be helped by painting the Red Cross on a white background on any house that suited them. They knew, of course, that it is the internationally respected symbol of immunity, the protection from attack. And yet they painted it on houses in which they garrisoned their senior officers and on houses in which they stored ammunition. The school itself had been turned into an arms dump. There has to be something in the Geneva Convention or some such code of war that forbids it. The weapons of war are stacking high, and as one pile is gathered up and stored away, so another takes its place. A lot will be destroyed, but what is in good condition will become ours to use. As one British Army officer put it to me, the Argentine junta must be made to lose money as well as face. Certainly, their Falklands expedition is going to cost them. Their garrison was well stocked, and when we realized what had been available to them, we were grateful that the only thing they lacked was the will to fight.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has called on Argentina to end all fighting in the South Atlantic now that Argentine troops in the Falklands have surrendered. But Argentina has not agreed. It has not admitted yet that its troops have surrendered. Its communiques speak only of a ceasefire and an agreement to withdraw. In Washington, American State Department sources think Argentina will try to fight on. The British Land Force commander, Major General Jeremy Moore, accepted the surrender in East and West Falklands by the Argentine General Menendez. It was General Menendez who had led the Argentine invasion, and he asked for terms. General Moore was chaired and cheered by everyone within reach, and the youngest islanders were taken to see him. He walked around Port Stanley saying, "I'm Jeremy Moore, and I'm sorry it took us 3 weeks to get here." British forces have been sent to West Falkland to arrange the surrender there. The 14,800 Argentine prisoners have been a surprise to the British forces. It seems British troops, half their number, defeated them. The Defence Secretary, Mr. John Nott, made it clear it's up to Argentina now to decide the end of the war if it wants all its men home. The Governor of the Falklands, Mr. Rex Hunt, is to return there as soon as possible as a civilian commissioner. It will be the Army who will repair the airstrip, rebuild the houses, and put back the water supply at Port Stanley. Mrs. Thatcher said 3,000 British troops would stay there from now on. If necessary, Britain would defend the islands alone. Tonight, British forces, especially the Harrier pilots, are still on the alert. The Marines, the Paras, the Scots Guards, who had pushed forward from Port San Carlos through mist, frost, and now snowstorms,
took hill after hill before Port Stanley and forced an occupying garrison of superior numbers to surrender. General Moore has spoken of the supreme quality of the men he's been leading. He praised their energy, fitness, and sheer devotion.
Hard weather, hard country, and a determined enemy have made it a jolly hard slog for them, and you've seen them. They've marched from the far end of this island right to this end of it, and they're as fit and ready to go as ever. You've seen them this evening, looking just like that. We have felt the ferocity of the very brave pilots of the Argentinian Air Force. Does this mean that hostilities from the mainland of Argentina will cease in General Menendez' view, do you think? General Menendez has just given me an assurance that there will be no attacks from mainland Argentina on us or our ships or aircraft in this area. Would you dare echo the words of the Duke of Wellington, this might have been a damn near run thing? Logistically, it was a damn close run thing. Some of my guns this morning that started 400 rounds a gun were down to 20.
Our reporters Jeremy Hands and Michael Nicholson, who've been with the task force since it left Southampton, were with the British troops when the Argentines surrendered. Here are their reports. First, Jeremy Hands.
The news of the Argentine surrender reached us as we marched towards Stanley, still expecting one last battle. At first, the Royal Marines around me just couldn't believe it. We were marching between the Two Sisters Hills and Sapper Hill, where the Argentines were known to be dug in and in strength. Then the report came back that they'd been seen running off Sapper Hill towards Stanley. Minutes later, we heard that another British unit, almost parallel to us, were actually in the town and not encountering any opposition. On we marched towards the outskirts of Stanley, and more signs of the Argentines having abandoned their last positions in great haste. And then, almost before we could take it in, we were in the town itself. Fires were still burning, houses still smouldering, but the Argentines had seemed to have gone. At this point, I spoke to Brigadier Julian Thompson, commander of the Victoria's 3 Commando Brigade. He was as surprised as he was delighted that it was apparently all over. Frankly, I thought it could take another 24 hours, he said, but I'm not complaining. And neither were any of the civilians we saw. They were almost delirious to see the British back. Union Jacks were being flown from every available vantage point. The troops who had expected to have to fight their way in were almost as bemused. The Argentines had shifted to the eastern side of the town, awaiting the formalities of the surrender to be completed. But there was no doubt that it was all over bar the cheering. And then, after darkness, the announcement that the surrender had been signed. There was little renewed cheering. It was by then a foregone conclusion. This morning, the destruction that had been caused during the 2.5 months of occupation could be seen more clearly. Buildings wrecked, homes in tatters, and property destroyed. But for all that, the residents said they hadn't been treated too badly. Then, with the Royal Marines and paratroopers settled in, the thousands of Argentine troops started to lay down their arms. There was no formal surrender ceremony, no victory parade by the British, just a rather pathetic trail of cold and dejected Argentines dumping their weapons in enormous piles in the snow. Then they shuffled back towards the airport, and there, more destruction than anywhere else I'd seen during the entire campaign. A few charred remains of buildings, 18 Argentine aircraft, mostly wrecked beyond any hope of repair, and scores of shell and bomb craters, although remarkably only a couple had damaged the runway. And now it's the race to get the prisoners away, the town back to normal, and as every British soldier I've spoken to says, to get back home. Jeremy Hands, British Television News, in Port Stanley.
The signing of the surrender was the conclusion of 4 days of intensive fighting as British troops leapfrogged towards the tiny capital that was the Argentines' headquarter garrison. And whatever else has been said about the Argentine troops, they put up a fight to defend their positions. Yesterday, I was there at the end to witness the final attack on the Argentines' last defense of Stanley, a hill called Mount Sapper. To get to it, our troops had to fight their way to 2 other hills, Mount Tumbledown and Mount William. And after 13 hours of battle, and under incessant artillery and mortar fire, men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion
men of the Scots Guards and men of the Gurkha Rifles swept up Sapper Hill with Argentine soldiers running, and I mean running, from their trenches along the ridge, past Sapper Hill and down the slopes on the other side into Stanley. The second paras were swooping down off Wireless Ridge, the Scots Guards off Tumbledown, and the Gurkhas off William. It was a sight never to be forgotten, and an end to a night of fighting I hope never again to have to witness. At one point, it must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning, it began to snow heavily. And it wasn't long before the flares showed up our own men moving across the plain, sharply defined in their dark camouflage against the white of the snow. But despite the snow, despite the machine gun fire, despite the mortars and artillery, they inched their way forward, lying flat in the snow, hardly moving as each barrage of shells landed around them. There was no stopping the British advance. Around to the left of us, on the other side of a mountain called Two Sisters on Wireless Ridge, were the men of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. Along the ridge that led into Stanley, we could see the tiny dots of Argentine troops running from their positions, throwing down their guns, running out of our sight down the slopes on the other side that was Stanley. Then, at 5 to 4 in the afternoon, our company commander came out of his trench with the news.
Now that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
Is there a white flag flying?
There is a white flag flying over Stanley.
Bloody marvellous. Bloody marvellous, he said, and he meant it. And that's how we all heard it. The fighting has stopped, and our war, here at least, is over. Michael Nicholson, ITN, with the British forces on the Falkland Islands.
And now reports tonight from Port Stanley that Argentine troops turned on their officers when they heard news of the ceasefire.
Mrs. Thatcher told MPs the important thing was to establish with Argentina without delay that all hostilities in the South Atlantic were over. Then she said there would be time to look to the future of the islands, though it would be 6 months or more before the dust had settled.
MPs on all sides paid tribute to the success of British forces on the Falklands, but it was a day of political triumph too for the Prime Minister. She was loudly cheered by her backbenchers. One thanked her for her resolute leadership. It was in this mood that Mrs. Thatcher asserted that Britain's dominance had been restored and the nation would never again be the victim of aggression. The Labour leader, Mr. Michael Foot, also acknowledged the military achievement.
And so I think the relief is the greatest thing, and the relief that the bloodshed has stopped, and I believe that that is the main feeling up and down the country, coupled, of course, with a recognition of the great achievement of our forces in the way that they've done their job.
There are now immediate practical problems which are preoccupying the government and led Mrs. Thatcher to postpone a scheduled visit to the United Nations. The 15,000 Argentine prisoners of war are substantially more than expected and present formidable problems with a shortage of accommodation, water and food. And there's no indication yet that the Argentines are prepared to agree to a total end to hostilities, a ceasefire in the South Atlantic as a whole. Questioned by Dr. David Owen for the Social Democrats, Mrs. Thatcher made it clear some Argentine officers and commanders would be held back as prisoners until that total ceasefire has been agreed. But what of the future government of the Falklands? The immediate next step is to send the governor, Mr. Rex Hunt, back as civil commissioner, leaving General Moore responsible for military matters. From there on, the Prime Minister remains strongly at odds with opposition parties. Mr. Foot argued Britain would, sooner or later, have to consult with other countries about the future of the islands.
What was gained for this country through the operation of the United Nations. It's very foolish for people to deride the United Nations at such a time. If it had not been for the support Britain had under Resolution 502, we would never have had the military support from the United States. We would never have had the economic support from the countries in Western Europe. We would have had a much more difficult task altogether, and we will need that international support over the coming weeks and months and years. And if Mrs. Thatcher or anybody else says anything different, I'm sorry, they'll find out differently.
Does talk of international support mean that you want to hand over the Falklands to the United Nations
now?
No,
it isn't a question of handing them over, and of course the people of the Falkland Islands have got a right, as everyone agrees they should have, to have a say in their future. But if you're going to conduct the operations there, we have to have treaties and understandings with other nations. That has always been recognized by all governments in the past, and I believe it's going to be equally true in the future.
But Mrs. Thatcher was adamant. If necessary, Britain will continue to defend the islands alone, although she remains hopeful other countries, especially the United States, will be prepared to help. The government will consult the islanders and nobody else about their future, and there'd certainly be no role for the Argentines. And British soldiers hadn't risked their lives, she said, to create a United Nations trusteeship.
Speaking about the future of the islands, Mrs. Thatcher has already made it clear she'd welcome help from other countries, although no one has yet offered it. Our diplomatic editor, Michael Brunson, has been examining the problems the government now faces in the South Atlantic.
Well, at first hearing, Mrs. Thatcher's answer this afternoon to those who are saying that the Falklands will never be the same again was, in effect, why not? Yet there were some signs of possible changes to come. First, the Prime Minister recognised that the islands are much closer to Latin America than they are to the mother country. So perhaps with an eye to such things as negotiating future transport links through Uruguay or Chile, Mrs. Thatcher said of the islanders, "I recognise that they will need the friendliness of other states in the region," and she did not exclude the possibility of other countries helping to maintain the security of the islands. And there was a clear hint that the constitutional status of the islands might be altered to answer those who charge Britain with neo-colonialism, perhaps from their being a dependent territory, in other words a colony, to an associated state with far more internal self-government. Well, one thing that happens with such a change is that the title of governor disappears, though for now Rex Hunt is still the governor, even though the Prime Minister says he'll now be more like a civilian commissioner, with General Moore the military commissioner. Mr. Hunt and his wife were in high spirits this evening. Hearing about the ceasefire was like VJ Day, he said. He's optimistic that things won't just be the same on the Falklands, but better. And he doesn't really mind if he's called governor or not.
I think when I said I was optimistic about the future, things would be better, I think this is because the sovereignty dispute will not be hanging over our heads. It was the uncertainty of the sovereignty dispute that kept quite a lot of investment and I think quite a lot of people away from the islands and perhaps sent a few of the islanders away from the island. Well, frankly, I couldn't care less whether I'm called governor or civil commissioner or senior sixer, as long as I can get back and get on with the job of rehabilitation and getting on helping the islanders.
So, despite Mrs. Thatcher's apparent message of back to normal and business as usual on the Falklands, many minds in Whitehall are already at work in mapping out a different future, not just for the islands, but for our diplomatic relations in general. The Americans, for a start, are still very worried about the situation, with President Reagan pointedly referring today to what Washington could do to help resolve the conflict. And he, like many other leaders, sees some difficult months ahead, rebuilding relations with Argentina and her Latin American neighbours.
The only member of the Argentine administration who's spoken so far of a surrender at Port Stanley is the civilian foreign minister, Mr. Costa Mendes, and then only in passing. He said the surrender that may have occurred wouldn't alter Argentina's determination to gain sovereignty. 2 weeks ago, he told reporters surrender was not a word in his vocabulary. In Buenos Aires, there have been angry demonstrations against surrender. About 500 demonstrators shouted, "We want to know and we want guns." President Galtieri has called for a mass rally outside the presidential palace in Buenos Aires tonight. He says he'll explain what has been happening in the Falklands. He's due to address the rally in about 2.5 hours' time. Meanwhile, Norman Rees reports from Buenos Aires.
President Galtieri, fighting for his political survival and attempting to salvage something from the wreckage of his army's defeat, looks to be gambling everything on this personal appearance before his nation and his people. For 24 hours, Argentina has awaited a presidential statement on the surrender on the Falklands, and most expected it would come in the form of an official communique. But an hour ago, live coverage of World Soccer matches here was interrupted with captions urging people to gather outside Government House to hear a presidential address on Argentina's future. It follows a day in which the bitter disappointment and disillusionment of Argentines over their surrender has been clearly seen. Police carrying rifles and tear gas grenades have moved in to break up groups of demonstrators attempting to rally outside Government House. There have been several arrests, and a number of television crews have been beaten up
by mobs angry enough to turn their attention towards anything that represents Britain or America. Some sources here say that Galtieri has lost the support of several important elements within the armed forces and the police, and that the continued disintegration of morale could even lead to civil war. It's against this background that President Galtieri will presumably attempt tonight to justify the Falklands occupation, to explain his surrender, and to rally his people behind his faltering government. Norman Rees, News at 10 in Buenos Aires.
In the Falklands, victors and vanquished are sharing freezing weather and inadequate accommodation tonight, close to the scenes of the task force's final successful assault. There's been praise for the British troops, praise for the Harriers. The Hermes flew its 1000th Harrier mission in the last days of the fighting. And now perhaps a reappraisal of the future of the armed forces as a whole. Our defence correspondent Geoffrey Archer assesses the campaign for the Falklands.
The 15,000 Argentine prisoners on the Falklands are said to be in poor condition, and certainly as the winter weather gets worse, the problem of giving them shelter will be great without any of the 4,500 tents lost when the container ship Atlantic Conveyor was sunk. But reports that the Argentines were short of supplies seem not to be true. A large container ship successfully beat the British blockade, bringing thousands of tons of food in early May, and transport planes were landing at Stanley up to last weekend. But just to ease the burden of looking after the Argentines, Britain will want to ship many of the prisoners home as soon as possible. But the rest could be held for negotiations, as the Defence Secretary John Nott explained.
But so far as the full repatriation is concerned, we must wait to see whether the Argentinians do intend to cease hostilities. If they don't, under the Geneva Convention, they are prisoners of war and we have a right to retain them.
But this means that if the Argentines threaten to continue bombing our positions, for example, on the Falklands,
yes,
then we will hold some of their prisoners as hostage until they stop.
Well, it's not hostage. The Geneva Convention is very clear on the rights of prisoners, and we will be over-scrupulous in meeting every single requirement of the Geneva Convention. As prisoners of war, they're not hostages. They would be in precisely the same position as, for instance, prisoners of war in the last World War. But where we have wounded, where there is shortage of food, where they're suffering from exposure, I think there we would want to get them back to Argentina as soon as we possibly could.
Following their success in the Falklands, the armed forces will be looking to the government to be less harsh in its cutbacks in defence spending in future. The Royal Navy will point out the success of its 2 aircraft carriers in the South Atlantic and the vital role of both of them. The Navy will say it was pure luck that both ships were available and that neither was in refit. The Navy wants 3 carriers to ensure 2 always available. But Mr. Nott's defence review last year fixed the number at only 2. But will the Falklands change defence policy?
Of course, it might have been better if we'd had more aircraft carriers, more ships, more missiles, more of everything. But we have been spending more than any of our other allies on defence. And in the end, the size of our forces always will come down to the size and strength of our economy and what the British people are prepared to pay. Now, I think now there'll be a feeling we want to pay more for our defence. It's been a magnificent success. I mean, a great triumph for the services and for the military people.
The Royal Navy say that the Falklands dispute has shown the need to have 2 aircraft carriers operational. And in order to have 2 operational, there have to be 3 in the Royal Navy. Do you agree with that?
But I agree that you would have needed 2 carriers as a minimum in this operation, and to be sure of having always 2 in service, given that one will very occasionally be in refit, you need one in reserve. And we'll have to look at this. I'm not holding to any, I don't have any preconceived notions about what our lesson should be, but I do accept that there's an argument for having a carrier in reserve so that we always have 2 actually available and operational. I accept that, and we'll be looking into it very carefully.
Just what sort of British forces have to be left on the Falklands to garrison the islands will depend to some extent on whether Argentina agrees to a full cessation of hostilities. If she does, the garrison could be quite small. But if, as threatened, she continues to harass the British presence, the Royal Navy will have to keep several frigates and perhaps 2 nuclear-powered submarines in the area.
Wednesday, the 16th of June. The prisoners seem to have accepted their defeat without any outward malice. Almost the reverse. They seem relieved to be out of it. Mostly young, mostly conscripts, mostly wondering why anyone, least of all them, should want to fight over such cold, wet Antarctic islands. Better the pampas and warm sunshine of their motherland. Descriptions by some very senior British officers about the condition of the prisoners did not match mine, and I reckon to have seen many thousands of them by now. None looked, in the words of those officers, as if they'd just come out of Belsen. And I've met no one who has seen or who has heard second-hand of Argentine soldiers taking meat bones from dogs. No doubt those men out in the field who'd spent weeks on patrol or were stuck up high in a mountain on observation posts did suffer. But then so did our men doing the same job. It seems to me we must be careful not to overdo our peacetime propaganda. But the problem is to keep them fit and well. It would have been no problem at all if General Galtieri had shown some sense of urgency, some anxiety to have them home. But while the junta fought amongst itself and the removal of General Galtieri was being arranged, the passage of these prisoners home was delayed. And whoever was president by the time they got home would still find their arrival embarrassing. Nothing could be more humiliating for him and his junta than the arrival of 10,000 men without victory, without their guns, without even their bootlaces. A defeated army returning to their motherland. The prisoners who suffered the worst humiliation were those waiting out on the airstrip. It had become their open prison. Thousands of them standing, sitting, wandering aimlessly about in the rain and biting winds. Some lived in tents, mostly the NCOs. Others lived under any kind of makeshift shelter they could find, from oil drums, bits of damaged aircraft, some even in the cockpits of smashed aircraft. Anywhere to keep dry. And surviving, like all defeated armies in the first days of defeat, as best they could. They moved only as fast as the British military could process them to the waiting ships. And the road that led from the airstrip to the harbour in Stanley was jammed with them. Long, shuffling lines of men, cold, miserable, human litter of war. It reminded me of the Egyptian retreat after their war against Israel in 1967. But more important, some people here would say, was the welfare of our own men, especially the Royal Marines commandos who'd borne the brunt of the fighting since D-Day, May 21st, living in trenches that filled with water that turned to ice, in trenches on mountains that filled with snow that turned to ice, living and sleeping a 24-hour day in sub-zero temperatures and maintaining what the generals called battle preparedness. That is, despite a hungry tummy, wet feet and frozen fingers, you're ready to fight. These men, too, needed to come in from the cold. As the Marines warmed up, the paras remembered their dead in a Thanksgiving service at Stanley Cathedral. They were reminded by their padre, David Cooper, that they had much to be thankful for.
When we were on the Norland, you remember we had a service not long before we went down onto the car deck to embark on the LCUs to become the 1st Battalion to assault these shores. I was also going to add the 1st Battalion to break out of the beachhead, the 1st Battalion to engage the enemy sensibly, and the 1st Battalion to march into Stanley. 2 para. However... You are not the same person. I'm not the same person that I was or that you were when we were on the Norland. We have all experienced events in the last 4 weeks that have probably changed our lives considerably. When you hear the whistle of something coming in, you're not sure what it is, but you know it's nasty. Or you've got a bit of cover and you know that you're going to have to get up and move and there's somebody trying to kill you, then you begin to see what the priorities are in life. You begin perhaps even to talk to God. But when you're faced with these stark realities, I think you would be a very insensible person if you didn't think more profoundly than perhaps you ever have in your life before. Certainly, people have said to me, you know, I've learnt more about myself in the last 10 minutes than I've learned in my entire life so far. What I would ask you to remember is what you felt when you thought you were going to die, and what was important to you then. It may have been your wife, it may have been your girlfriend, it may have been your dog. It may even have been your life itself. But remember, when the chips are down, that's what's important. And when life becomes easy again, and these realities become obscured, just remember that when you did have your back against the wall, spiritually, mentally, when things did cause you to think very, very hard about what really mattered, remember how much God figured in that. And don't forget. And remember who was important to you. And when you get home, and you've been back home 4 or 5 weeks, and you're beginning to take your wife or your girlfriend or your dog for granted, well, just remember, think on, as I say, in the part of the world that Colonel Gerard and I come from, what is important, and try to model and mould your life on that. Because if that's what's seen you through to this, then it won't do you any harm in seeing you through the rest of your life. Remember those who will not be going home with us. Those who we lost at Goose Green and Darwin. Those whom we lost from Mount Longdon on to Radio Ridge. And we think and pray for their loved ones to whom they will not return.
Thursday the 17th, now is the time to tidy up and repair. First on the list of priorities was the water pumping station blown up by the Argentines as they surrendered. The Royal Engineers began work on it immediately. As important to the military was the repairs to the runway at the airstrip. British bombing raids by RAF Vulcans and Royal Naval Sea Harriers had done enormous damage, though not as much to the actual runway as we'd first been told. The Vulcans had come all the way down from Ascension Island, 4,000 miles away, but in their 3 raids, and of the 63 bombs dropped, only 1 hit the runway. It was the Sea Harriers off the carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible that did the real damage. The Pucaras, the Argentine ground attack aircraft, the ones British troops thought they would suffer most from, were effectively grounded very early on by the Harrier pilots. The Royal Engineers are about to work on the runway so that British planes can land, a prospect that delights us all, especially the Marines and Paras, who still have hopes of seeing what's left of the British summer. And the tiny capital itself needs tidying up. The debris of war needs to be cleared away, the streets hosed down, and the houses searched for booby traps and other devices before families, who evacuated to friends and relatives outside the town, can return. The Falklanders are in need of financial and moral encouragement. They have
been sorely tried.
It's been very long. It's been very long, to seem like years. And you never knew from one day to the next whether your house would be safe or not, if you go home and you would find Argentines in it or not. So it was a very worrying time, and also we were very worried about the British troops and how they were faring in the fields. But we didn't have any doubts at all that they would get through in the end.
What did you think when the British went to begin with?
I'm afraid I cried. I cried a lot because, you know, Britain had gone and all we knew had gone, and it was just something totally new and unknown to us that arrived, and we never knew how they would treat us and what would become of us.
You see, we lived almost surrounded by the soldiers, which is known as the sort of military zone. And time again, I'd go to the door and I'd find 7 or 8, 9 soldiers standing there with guns and all sorts of excuses. I gave them the tape we could. I tried to be as kind, as friendly as I did, and I waved to them because
You didn't know what was going to happen?
No.
Well.
No, and so when you find these people there, although they never hurt any civilians, not one, I don't think, but it's just so terrifying living and brought up in a British colony as we had been. Perhaps I shouldn't even say colony now, but we were so British, and then to find all these guns there, it was just terrifying. And I used to open the door and I used to cry and
Friday the 18th, and the first backfire of resentment. During the night, prisoners of war, 20, possibly more, broke away from their guards and set fire to a store next to the Globe Public House. Others smashed windows in nearby houses and threw their helmets into the windows of passing cars. It was anyone's guess why. Possibly resentment, or the rumour spreading among them that they would not be shipped home. But more serious, though, were the fires. There had been 5 other fires since Tuesday, giving rise to the suspicion that the Argentines have left behind delayed action incendiary devices. Local firemen and soldiers worked together as bullets exploded around them. At 11:30 that Friday morning, the 3 Falklanders who had died in the fighting, the only 3, were buried in a tiny cemetery overlooking the harbour. Mrs. Sue Whitley, aged 30 and a teacher, Mrs. Doreen Bonner, 46, and Mrs. Mary Goodwin, 81. Their coffins were carried by 6 Marines and 6 paras. The women had died when British artillery bombarded Argentine guns that had been deliberately placed between their houses. Argentine prisoners in the streets, clearing up the rubbish, were told by their guards to take off their caps and stand to attention as the coffins passed. Afterwards, Mr. Harold Rowlands, the island's chief administrator, spoke of his gratitude to the men who had died in the fighting.
We have lost 3 of our own community, but we're also very much in debt to those servicemen that have given their lives, and also we remember them at this time, and also the wounded. The people of the Falkland Islands realized that we were going to have a very tough time, and I think that like the rest of us to the left, we're very fortunate.
And then, unexpectedly, shortly after midday, a formation of Royal Naval Sea-King helicopters flying a white ensign came overhead us, which gave me the opportunity I'd wanted to pay tribute to these men and their machines. Without them, this war would have taken so much longer to win. Saturday and Sunday, the 19th and 20th of June, and the last of the Argentine prisoners shuffled their way slowly along the jetty in Stanley Harbour to the boats that took them home, on the ships Canberra and Norland. A week ago, they ruled this place. They were here to stay, they thought, in their Malvinas Islands. But now, dirty and unshaven, they left ignored by everyone except their armed guards. Whatever else is said, Port Stanley will remain a British military garrison for some long time to come, and the Falklands will become part of British servicemen's tour of duty. And the Falklands campaign will make all those who fought in it proud to say, we were there. It's 11 weeks now since we left Portsmouth with the bands playing and that forest of Union Jacks along the shoreline. It feels like a year, and that's as long as some people expected this war to last, as long as it would take to get the Argentines out. We all know here, and you all know there, how costly this war has been, how bloody it's been. So it's probably best that I simply end my report from the Falkland Islands with those last words of the surrender document. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, Port Stanley on the Falkland Islands. General Jeremy Moore, Commander Land Forces, was into Stanley soon after them to accept the surrender. And after 4 hours of what was loosely described as negotiations, the surrender document was signed by him and the Argentine garrison commander, General Mario Menendez. It read as follows. In Port Stanley at 9 p.m., 14th of June 1982, Major General Menendez surrendered to me all Argentine forces in East and West Falklands together with their impedimenta. Arrangements are in hand to assemble them for their return to the Argentine, to gather their arms and equipment, and to mark and make safe their munitions. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. And it ended, God save the Queen. Just after midnight, British time, with the niceties of surrender settled, General Moore went to the hospital and met the nurses who'd remained there throughout the shelling.
Forgotten what the building's called.
General, were you surprised at the speed, 3 weeks or so from start to finish, it took you to reach Stanley?
No, I don't think I was surprised. Clearly the enemy was surprised. He was surprised because quite clearly he hadn't expected us to land that far away and therefore had not really defended the area. I think that the reason it could be done was because he simply didn't understand that our troops would be able to do that.
The troops themselves were able to manage out in the mountains. You came across the way which presumably nobody expected you would be able to take.
Clearly he didn't expect us to come across that way. Clearly he didn't expect, and one of my officers who speaks extremely good Spanish has been talking to a number of them, and they believe that we came across because we had enormous numbers of helicopters. They'd simply find it difficult, if not impossible, to believe that actually, as you know, some of the units simply marched the whole way. And that is having troops of the quality one does have. We had plenty of ammunition with the force to have gone on a long time, but any operation is a matter of judgment, and we were having to balance the ability of even our extremely good and experienced troops, many of whom are Arctic trained, to withstand the conditions in the mountains, against having the ideal amount of ammunition to continue a battle for a very long time. As the Duke of Wellington said after Waterloo, it was a damn fine thing, or a damn close run thing. Similarly here, in some ways, this was a close run thing, in that batteries of guns which started that final night with 400 rounds a gun were down to as few as 6. And it was, as you realize, a tremendous problem getting all that stuff all this way. And with the losses that were suffered on the way of a great deal of engineer equipment and, for instance, a large proportion of our heavy lift helicopters, it was an astonishing performance by the logisticians. Back to Wellington again, and the way he described the systems of the French and British armies of his time, that the French system was like a fine harness, and it was beautiful to look at, and it worked very well until something went wrong. But once the leather broke, the leather had broken. The British one was made of rope, and when that broke, you tied a knot. Well, we tied a lot of knots this time, and it kept going.
There's also the question of casualties. They were, in human terms, that's dreadful. In military terms, they were quite light, weren't they? What do you attribute that to?
I would attribute that to basically the quality, skill, and determination of the young men in the formation I had the privilege to command. I think you would agree with me that if anybody has a go back home about the quality of the youth in our country, they ought to have seen these guys. They were absolutely tremendous. And having real determination and getting really stuck into it in the long run is the way to save casualties, of course.
As you came close to the town, you had civilians, you had civilian houses, you had a battle going on around them. Was it difficult to pick your way around that?
That was undoubtedly a problem, and of course we came here in order to help the people of these islands. That, as I see it, is the basic difference between ourselves and the Argentines. They were fighting for the islands and we were fighting for the islanders. Clearly, the problem was that as they withdrew into the town and withdrew more and more of their equipment into the town and were putting guns in the town, it made it very difficult to get at those guns and to prevent them from causing us unnecessary casualties and so on without endangering civilians. We tried very hard. As you know, I got it wrong on one occasion, and that's my responsibility, and of course I'm extremely sorry that it happened. And with our naval gunfire support one night, we did kill some civilians. I thought that the civilians were all in a particularly well-defined area of the town, and therefore we were free to engage the other areas. On that occasion, I'm afraid I got it wrong.
And what quality were your opponents?
We've mentioned the Air Force, who were extremely courageous and very good. The regular members of the Argentine Army and Marine Corps were also, I think, very good. Their artillery was skillfully handled. Their men manning the machine guns, like the one you mentioned, were extremely skillful and very determined and stayed there and jolly well had to be winkled out. Their ordinary conscript soldiers' heart was certainly not in it. And you, I think, also will have seen much evidence that that was so. And they had to be held in their position by their officers. And really they were not very high quality. But that doesn't alter the fact that it required a great deal of very determined fighting by our people to winkle out the ones who were extremely good.
What was it that produced that surrender and that collapse? It seemed just to happen.
I've never witnessed an event like that before, but I joined the services after the end of the war. I've not witnessed such a thing, so I don't really think I could say what it is. It is obviously the collapse of will, which is arrived at some point. And I suppose in all major campaigns that one has come across through history, there comes a point where there is a collapse of will, and suddenly it spreads. It's astonishing the speed with which it spreads, isn't it? A fascinating morning that was. We had I'd just been up in the mountains with the two brigadiers discussing what we were going to do next, and I'd given my orders, and they were about to start the next phase. And suddenly there they were, all over the hills, standing up and coming out of their holes and things, and we just stopped firing and held everything. There was, it was a touch-and-go business because we had an airstrike coming in, and of course it was quite a difficult business to get to the pilot in the aeroplane to hold it off. But suddenly they just weren't fighting anymore, were they? Fascinating.
The local population had built a simple cairn out of rocks and cement and topped it with a black steel cross in honor of the 18 men who died in the battle for their liberation. At the center of the cross, a small brass plaque to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones and his men. And the locals came too to say their farewells and their thanks to the Parras. The service was a short one. The dead had already been buried with full military honours at Ajax Bay shortly after the battle.
This is my commandment.
Major Chris Keeble, the man who'd taken the battalion on to victory after Colonel Jones had fallen, read a passage from the Gospel.
A man can have no greater love than to lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends. if you do what I command you.
And then the locals paid their own tribute and laid 2 wreaths at the foot of the cairn with the simple message, "We will not forget."
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
And then the little ceremony was over. The Paras had paid their last respects on the field that had brought them both glory and the pain of mourning. And as they left, the lone piper came out of the gorse that had once marked the front line and played a lament that was almost carried away on the biting wind. He picked his way through the craters left by the artillery and mortar fire of the battle and past the spot where Colonel Jones had died.
Thank you, Robin. After this. It's a dismissal. You're still going to
It compared in that it was our war, it was my war. I mean, I felt it was as much my war as the Marines and the Paras because it was a British war. And in that respect, it differed from all the other wars, in that all the other wars have been somebody else's war.
Is there any one thing that you are going to remember about this war, Mike?
Well, the thing that hit me most of all was after the very first casualties, that is the sea casualties, Sheffield and then Belgrano. And I thought, well, this is going to change people's resolution at home. They wanted us to take the Falklands, but I wondered if they expected casualties. And of course they didn't. Nor did they after the second ship went down. Nor did they when we landed and had casualties on land. And I was astounded at the single-mindedness of people at home and the single-mindedness of people in the forces. You know, if I remember anything about the war, it'll be the single-mindedness of the soldiers. The Paras, for example, bad casualties at Darwin Goose Green, lost their CO. Just before they were going in for a second time to go into Stanley for that final assault, we spoke to them, and I said, "Still no doubts?" "No doubts at all, none whatsoever. You know, this is our war, this is our island, and the Argies are going to leave it, and until they have, we're going to keep at it." That's what I remember.
2,500 people filled St. Paul's for the service, where the nation's salute was led by members of the royal family. Prince Charles, in full naval dress, was with the Princess of Wales on her first public engagement since the birth of Prince William. And the Queen came to St. Paul's not just as the monarch, but also as a mother, to give thanks that her son, Prince Andrew, still on active service in the Falklands, survived the bitter conflict. Prince Andrew's father and grandmother gave their thanks too. Politicians from all sides of the House joined the service. They included 3 former Prime Ministers and those in the government who bore the brunt of the responsibility for launching the task force, the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister. And there to represent the wounded, Lieutenant Robert Lawrence of the Scots Guards, shot in the head on Tumbledown Mountain. He had pride of place in front of his senior officers, among them Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, commander of the task force, Rear Admiral Woodward and Major General Jeremy Moore. But this service belonged to the fighting soldiers, sailors and airmen from the ranks, and to the next of kin of the 254 men who lost their lives. they heard the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Runcie, appeal for their prayers to go out also to the bereaved in Argentina.
People are mourning on both sides of this conflict. In our prayers, we shall quite rightly remember those who are bereaved in our own country and the relations of the young Argentinian soldiers who were killed. Common sorrow could do something to reunite those who were engaged in this struggle. A shared anguish can be a bridge of reconciliation. Our neighbors are indeed like us.
The Roman Catholic Archbishop, Cardinal Basil Hume, read the prayer of remembrance.
God, our Father, in whom the dead find life, listen, we beseech you, to our prayers. Grant that all who have fallen in battle may find in you the peace that this world cannot give and enjoy eternal life. You know how saddened we are by the death of those for whom our love is great. We ask you to comfort and console those who mourn and grieve.
The 2-minute silence following the last post was perhaps the best time to remember those who went down with the 6 sunken ships, the heroes of the San Carlos landings, of Goose Green and Bluff Cove, and the other now famous names of the battle for the Falklands. It was an occasion to give thanks to those who returned safely, to honor and comfort those who returned bearing the wounds of war, but most of all to honor those who will never come back. This service, this day, carried this message: those who fell in the Falklands, like the fallen of other wars, shall never be forgotten. Norman Rees, News at 10 at St. Paul's Cathedral.